Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. This video will be the introduction to the CSS crash course. CSS is the primary way to add styling to web pages. For example, we can use it to change the colors of text, lay out elements on the page, or even create complex animations like you see throughout the Algo Expert website. What's great about CSS is the syntax is incredibly simple, so you could pick up the basics in a matter of minutes. However, the language still manages to support advanced features like animations and stacking elements along the three-dimensional z-axis. All that said, you will oftentimes hear developers complain about CSS, and yes, it can be incredibly frustrating to debug at times. But the reality is, CSS doesn't need to be that difficult. It was designed to be simple and easy to use, and the frustration of using it usually just comes from a lack of proper understanding of the language's core concepts, such as the box model used for layout, or stacking contexts, which are used to determine the order of elements on that z-axis. In this crash course, we will not just be going through a variety of CSS properties, but rather we will be diving deep into some of the more advanced and nuanced features of CSS to break all of these misconceptions. Developing this strong understanding of CSS is fundamental in both passing front-end interviews and becoming a productive front-end engineer. For the interviews, you could be asked to implement a real web page following some specification, and you would need this knowledge of CSS to do this quickly in the interview setting without getting stuck too long on any seemingly simple tasks like centering an element. Additionally, you could be asked more quiz-style questions about CSS, which the crash course should help you prepare for, and of course, you can also take the Front-End Expert quiz to gauge your knowledge and readiness for this style of question. That said, CSS isn't just important for the front-end interview. As a front-end engineer, you will need to be able to quickly assess the difficulty of implementing a design when you work with designers to give them feedback on the feasibility of their designs. Moreover, once you go to implement these designs, you will need this knowledge of CSS to do this efficiently and correctly. And finally, as your projects grow in size, you will want to make sure that you are following CSS best practices to avoid creating a codebase that is impossible to maintain. And of course, we will discuss these best practices in the crash course as well. Okay, so with that, I hope this gives you a good idea of why CSS is so important to both the front-end interview and improving productivity as a front-end engineer. So let's get right into the crash course, and I'll see you in the next video. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the CSS position property and everything it does to determine how an element is positioned in the document. So here's an example. We have a HTML file with a paragraph. This is I am a paragraph. This is the blue paragraph at the top of the output. And then we have this section. The section contains a div with the ID of box, and this is the green box we see, and then this very long paragraph, and it has the ID of long. And now let's go over to the CSS and see everything happening here. So first, on the paragraphs, we're just setting some styling to make everything a little bit easier to see, making the font sizes bigger, adding some margin and padding, as well as the 2-pixel black borders. And then this selector here is the selector for the first paragraph because it's the only one directly nested within the body. We set its background to light blue. Here we have the box, so this is that light green box. We set its width and height as well as we gave it a border. And then the long paragraph, we gave a light yellow background. By default, we say all of the elements on the page are what we call static positioned. And this is just the positioning that we've been used to. So if I go to this website and I scroll, we'll see everything scrolls sort of how we would expect it to. But we can change the way this works by using the position property. So let's go to our box and we will add position. And let's start with fixed. So what fixed says is that this is going to be completely removed from the normal flow of the document. So you'll see this pushes it on top of other items. So now it is covering up our long paragraph. And then we can use the top property to move the box, so top 10 pixels, we'll set it 10 pixels from the top of the browser window. And now when I scroll, you'll see the box stays there because it is fixed to the viewport. So no matter what I do, this box will always be 10 pixels from the top of my browser window. We can also use the left property, so maybe I want it to go 200 pixels away from the left, save that, and now it's more towards the center and it will just stay here. There's also a bottom and a right property that do very similar things. So I can maybe change this to bottom, and you see now the box is stuck at the bottom of the page. So as I scroll, that box will just stay there at the bottom. As a word of warning, I would usually avoid position fixed, the reason being it can cover up other items on the page, which is obviously a bad user experience. That said, there can occasionally be good use cases for position fixed, so it's good to know that we have this option. Next, let's take a look at position relative. So position relative is fairly simple. It sticks the element where it normally would have been, and then it uses the bottom and left or the top and right properties to add an offset based on that natural position. So for example here, if I comment these out, you'll see this is its normal position. And then when we add these back in, it goes 10 pixels up from the bottom and 200 pixels over from the left. Same thing if we use, say, top of 20 pixels, then it will be 20 pixels down from where it was originally. And we can say something like left 100 pixels, and you'll see this will move everything over from the left. It's worth noting you can also use negative values here, so this will move it over towards the left. But most of the time, if you wanted to do this, you would actually just want to use right and then the other value, because this is going to usually end up doing the exact same thing. Now with position relative, it will stay where we put it. So as I scroll, it's going to scroll with the page. It's not going to be removed from the flow of the document like we saw with position fixed. And next, let's take a look at position sticky. So position sticky is sort of a mixture between position relative and position fixed. And the idea here is that when I scroll down, the element will stay where it was. So it will hit the top of 20 pixels and left of 100 pixels, and then it won't go away. It's going to stay on the page. And this is actually really great for things like navigation bars. So if I had maybe a top of 0, save this, and then when I scroll down, once it gets to the top, it's going to just stay there. So you can imagine if we had some navigation bar, we could use position sticky so that as the user scrolls, they always have access to that nav bar. But again, you do want to be careful that you are not covering up other elements on the page that you don't want to be covering up. This will act very similar to position fixed. Once you start scrolling, it essentially is a fixed element, so it is going to block other elements that are below it. So we need to be careful about that. But as long as we are, position sticky can be a great option for these navigation bars. We also do want to be cognizant of accessibility of browsers here though. Some of the older browsers didn't have support for position sticky. Most of the new and modern ones do. But if you're trying to support very old browsers, just know that position sticky might not work. And you might want to test your output on those old browsers to make sure that it is still doing something that is reasonable. Next, let's take a look at position absolute. So position absolute has sort of two purposes. Most of the time, this is going to act very similar to position fixed. The difference being that when I scroll, it's actually going to stay where it was on the page. So rather than being absolutely positioned with respect to the browser window, it is with respect to where it is on the page in the actual document. However, this isn't always the case. If the parent of a position absolute element is position relative, or rather if anything above it is a position relative, it will instead be positioned absolute to that relative item. So let me show you what I mean. If we remember, this box was inside of this section, so I can make this section position relative, and now the box will be positioned absolutely to that section. So you can see it moved down to the beginning of the section, but it still is absolutely positioned. It's still on top of the other items, and it is still following this top and left values. So it is now 0 pixels away from the top of the section, which now happens to be the top of the long paragraph, and it's 100 pixels away from the left of that section. Now, the next question you might have is, what if I want it to not be on top of these other elements? I want it to be positioned absolutely, but I want the other elements on top of it. And the way we can solve this is with what we call a z-index. So I'm going to go down to the long paragraph, and I can add a z-index property. And the z-index property allows you to say, I want this element to be at some height. So by default, everything's sort of at the 0 height at the same level. So I can change this to say it's at a z index of 2. And when I save, you'll notice nothing actually happens. And the reason for this is related to something we call stacking contexts. We'll get more into what that means in the video on stacking contexts, but for now just know that we need to be creating a new stacking context whenever we use z-index, and this doesn't happen by default with position static elements, and there's going to be lots of ways we can create the stacking context, but the easiest will be to set this to position relative, and again we will go much more in depth on why we need to do this in that video, but for now just know that usually with position static elements, we won't be able to use z-index immediately, and we'll need to change either the position or another property that will create that stacking context for us. And now you'll see the paragraph is actually on top of the box, so we can't see the box at all anymore. So what I can do is I'll add a negative 10 pixels to the top of the box just so we can see it sort of peeking out. Maybe we'll go even a little bit higher, negative 20 pixels. And you can see the box is now peeking out from behind the long paragraph. And of course, we can add z-index to more elements. So I could add a z-index to the box. And now these z-indexes are going to be competing with each other. So if I made this one 3, now the z-index of the box is greater than the z-index of the long paragraph. So the box is back on top. But of course, if I then change the long paragraph to be z-index of 4, it shows up on top again. And this can just keep on happening. And you could imagine you could have lots of different positioned elements all over the page, and you could be using different z-indexes to determine how high they are on the page. Now moving on from position and z-index, there's one more set of properties I want to look at for something called float. So let's go here and comment out these position changes we've made. So let's no longer use the position absolute or relative and go back to how we had it at the beginning. But we're going to try something called float. Now, float is very similar to position in that it does remove elements from the normal flow, but it allows us to take elements and have them sort of flow around other elements. So let me show you what I mean. Let's come over to the box, and I'm going to say float left. Save this, and you'll see now the paragraph is sort of wrapping around the box. So what float does is it just says, take this element and push it to one side of its container, in this case the left side, and then allow the elements below it to just wrap around it wherever there's empty space on the other side. And this is a very powerful tool, especially if you're doing something like a blog post and you want to have an image in it, but you don't want the image to take up the whole width. You can float text around the image and get some very nice sort of curving of the text. And we can actually do this with multiple items. So we could change the I am a paragraph to float right. And now you'll see the text is sort of wrapping around both of them. And I am a paragraph is on the right side of it because it's floating right, whereas the box is on the left side because it is floating left. And finally, sometimes you need some of the elements not to be paying attention to float. And what I mean by this is on the long paragraph, we could add this property clear. And clear allows an element to say, actually, I want to go below whatever is floating on the left or the right. So we can say clear both, and this is going to say both the elements that floated left and right, make sure I am below them. And then we could also do something just like clear right. And what this says is go below the item that floated right. If there's something floating left still that is bigger, we can still allow it to float. And then we could also do clear left. This isn't going to look like it does anything here because the element on the left is taller than the element on the right. So to clear the left one, we also have to clear the right one. So in this case, clear left is the same as clear both. And that's going to be the end of this video on position. As a closing thought, try to use position sparingly. We don't want to be setting lots of elements to position fixed and absolute. For the most part, we want our elements staying in the normal flow of the page, but we should use position when we need to, of course. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing stacking contexts, and going into how exactly z-index is actually working. So here in this HTML, we first have a section, and it contains two divs, red and blue, and those are the red and blue boxes in the output. And then outside of the section, we have one more div, and that has the ID of green, and this is the green box in the output. So let's take a look at the CSS file for this. So each of these divs is set to position fixed, and then there's some styles down here that are just making them easier for us to see. And then in each one, we are setting some properties. So for example, in green, we give it the background color of green. We set its top and left value, which is working again because it is position fixed. So this is just how far it is from the top and left of the browser window. And then we set the z-index. So right now, red has a z-index of 1, blue has a z-index of 2, and green has a z-index of 3. And this makes sense. If we look at the output, blue is visually on top of red, and green is visually on top of blue, which also makes it, of course, on top of red as well. And we could do something like change the red z-index to be 4, and now you'll see red is covering up green and blue. I'll put it back to 1, of course. But now let's look at what exactly is happening when we set these z-index values and we use position fixed. So anytime we add position fixed, it creates what we call a stacking context. And position fixed isn't the only way to create a stacking context. There are tons more. A few examples of them include position sticky also creates a stacking context. Position relative along with a z-index creates a stacking context. Transform properties create stacking contexts. And there are a ton more examples. So a stacking context is a grouping of elements on the z-axis. And in this case, each one of these is acting as its own stacking context because each one of these values, red, green, and blue, are all position fixed, which creates a stacking context for each one. And then the z-index says how high up in the z-axis is the stacking context. So right now, the green stacking context has a value of 3, the blue stacking context has a value of 2, and the red stacking context has a value of 1. And when each of the elements has its own stacking context, this is sort of what you expect. But what would happen if we went to the section and we created a stacking context here as well? So one of the ways we can do this is by setting it to position fixed. And then let's give it a z-index of 4, saying that the section is on top. And once this is saved, you'll see that green has been pushed all the way to the bottom. But green has a z-index of 3. Shouldn't it be on top of red and blue? What's happening here? Why is green below red and blue? Well, if we go back to the HTML, we can see that we have this section here, and then the green is outside of it. So this entire section is a stacking context because we made the section position fixed. And then this div with the ID green is also a stacking context, and we call these sibling stacking contexts because they are at the same level, not necessarily in the DOM tree, but they're at the same level within stacking contexts because they are both at the root level. They are the highest level stacking contexts we have other than just the base document stacking context. And this section has a z-index of 4, whereas the div of green has a z-index of 3. So what this means is that green is below the section, meaning that this green will be below everything inside of this section. And then red and blue, we aren't comparing them to green. We already know because they are in a higher stacking context parent that they are higher than green. The z-index of red and blue is only being used to compare them to each other within their stacking context parent. And because of that, we see that blue is on top of red. And of course, we can change that. So we could give blue maybe a -1 z-index. And you'll see now red is on top of blue. But even with a negative z-index, blue is still in front of green because blue's parent, the section, is a sibling stacking context to the green stacking context. And the section has a higher z-index than green does. But of course, if we made green's z-index higher than the z-index of the section, so we can make this 5, now green is ahead of red and blue. And regardless of what I do to red and blue, this can't change. So if I gave red a z-index of 1,000, it's still below green. And the reason for this is that red is inside of the section with a z-index of 4, which is lower than green. So no matter what we do to red, it's only comparing itself to blue, So changing the z-index of red is never going to put it on top of green, and the only way that red could ever be on top of green is if its parent stacking context, so the section, became higher than green. So again, we could change this to 6, and now red is back above green, as is blue, and these will always move as a unit. So if red is above green, so is blue, and likewise, if red is below green, blue is also below green. Now that'll do it for this video on stacking context. Again, there are a ton of ways to actually create a stacking context. So if you're running into any bugs related to z-index, most likely it's related to the fact that you either have more stacking contexts than you think you have, or you have less than you think you have because of some piece of code that is creating a new one. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS Flexbox, which is a layout system for building responsive websites. And what we mean by this is it will allow us to build websites that resize themselves based on the size of the window, creating a great user experience regardless of screen sizes. So let's get right into it and look at this example HTML file that we have here. Here inside of the body, we just have a section, and inside of that section, we have 3 divs, red, green, and blue. Pretty straightforward. Each one of them has a class as well as some text inside of it. And then if we go into our CSS file, we have a little bit of pre-written code. So first, the section, I've given a height of 90 VH, so 90% of the height of the viewport. And then I've given it a border of 2 pixels dotted black, which is just creating a dotted black border around the entire section. And then each of red, green, and blue have a different height as well as a background color that corresponds to their class name. The different heights are just to make it easier to tell what some of the Flexbox properties are going to be doing, and you'll see why that's helpful in a minute. And finally, in the div rule set, we are setting some generic styling to affect all 3 of the red, green, and blue divs. So we have a border of 5 pixels solid black, so we can see the edges of them, a padding of 0.5 rem, a font color of white, a font size of 2 rem, and we set the font weight to be bold. Okay, so now let's get into the actual Flexbox. What Flexbox is it allows us to define a Flexbox container and then Flexbox items. And a container will be whatever is surrounding the Flex items. So to create a Flexbox container, we set something to display Flex. So I'll do this on the section. And the idea here is that we create this display Flex on whatever is around the Flex items, so whatever we want to lay out. So if we look at the HTML here, because we set display Flex on the section, it now says that all 3 of these divs are Flex items, which essentially changes the way that all 3 of these divs will be laid out on the page. And it's worth noting here that this is only affecting direct children. So if one of these divs had more children, it would only be making the top level div a Flex item, whereas the nested elements are just nested inside of that Flex item. They are not Flex items themselves. So direct children of something with display Flex are Flex items, and whatever we set display Flex to is a Flex container. Okay, so now let's look at what actually happened when I set it to display Flex. All of these divs are now on one line, and they are no longer stretching the full width of the page. They're just stretching the width of their content. And this is sort of the default behavior of Flexbox. But we can go through it and go through all of the different options of how we can get different layouts with this, how we can have it stretch the full width, how we can have it not stretch the full width, and lay out in different places all over the page. So first, let's look at the direction that we are flexing in, as we say. So there's a property, flex direction, and this defaults to row. So if I save it with row, nothing's going to change. What row says is put all of the flex items horizontally in a row. However, we could change it to column, and what this now says is instead stack them vertically on top of each other. And since this is a column layout and there's only one element per row, these elements now have the space to horizontally stretch out to fill up the container. We can also do something like column reverse, and this is the same thing, but it will change the order as well as it throws everything sort of at the bottom. We can do the exact same thing with row reverse. So this will end up with everything on the far right with it in backwards order. And the way we actually refer to this is the main axis. So flex direction with row, so I'll go back to just the default value of row for a moment, is going to say that the main axis is horizontal, meaning that the main flexing that is happening is horizontal. Whereas if we change this to column, then we are saying the main axis is the vertical axis. We're flexing vertically. And then we call the other one the cross axis. So for now, let's leave this as row. And within the main axis, we can use this property justify content to say how we want the elements in the axis to be laid out. So it starts with flex start. This is the default value, so this won't do anything. And this says put everything at the beginning of the main axis. But we could change this to say flex end, and it will push everything to the right side. We could also do something like space around, and what this says is evenly space out the elements. We can also do space between, and this is very similar to space around, the difference being that it doesn't put any space around the outside elements. They get pushed all the way to the edge of the flex container. Additionally, we can combine this with different flex directions. So for example, if I said row reverse, remember this changed the order of everything, but when we hadn't specified a justify content value, everything got pushed over to the right, and maybe we don't want that. So what we can do is we can change the justify content to flex end, and since we are in row reverse, flex end is now the left side, and flex start becomes the right side when we are in row reverse. And the same thing will happen with column and column reverse. So let's change this to flex direction of column, and you'll see now with flex end, all of our values end up at the bottom because the column is now the main axis. So justify content is now controlling how these elements are laid out vertically. And we said flex end, which is going to be at the bottom. We can also change this to column reverse. And now we are in reverse order, and flex end is now the start because of the fact that we are in reverse order. But with all that said, let's put this back to row. It will be a little bit easier to work with for the majority of what we want to do throughout this video. And next, we might want to change how things are aligned on the cross axis. So the main axis, again, is the direction we are flexing, and the cross axis is the other direction. And the way we can do this is with a property called align items. And align items is just like justify content, except it is for the cross axis. So for example, I could say flex end, and you'll see all of the items moved all the way down to the bottom of the flex container because we are now on the cross axis going all the way to the end. Similarly, we could do align items center, and this would go all the way to the center. You can also use justify content center. So this is a really easy way to center things. Centering in CSS can be extremely difficult sometimes, and an easy way to do it is to set display flex on the container as well as justify content center and align items center, and that will immediately center all of the direct children of that flex container, so the flex items will all be centered. And next, you might notice that there's no space between these items, and we said we wanted them all centered, but we might want some space between them, and there's a property for that as well, and that's called gap. So gap is just that, it's the space between the items, and I could say maybe 10 pixels. This will add a 10 pixel gap between all of them. Now, gap is very similar to margin. It is almost the exact same thing. The only difference really is that it's specific to Flexbox, and it is just the gap between the flex items rather than having to set it on every single flex item and which portions you need margin on. It is a little bit more automatic. So if we just want the same spacing between all of our flex items, gap is usually the easier way to go for that. And next, what I want to look at is what happens if we have more items flexing than just 3. So let's go back to our HTML and let's copy all of this and let's add some more flex items. And maybe we can add even a few more. So now we have 9 flex items, and you can see we're out of space, and we have a scroll bar on our website now, so you can scroll and see all of them, but we probably don't want this. It's overflowing from the flex container. And the way we can control this is with what we call flex wrap. So flex wrap defaults to what is no wrap, which is what we are seeing right now, which is just overflowing. But we can change this to wrap, and this will instead go to a new line when it runs out of space. We can also do wrap reverse, which works very similar to row reverse in that we still get the wrap effect, but we will get it in reverse order. So every new line that we go to will happen in backwards order. But let's go back to your wrap, and you can see it is just going to a new line when it runs out of space rather than overflowing. Now it's worth showing also, there's a bit of a shorthand here, so we can specify flex direction and flex wrap with one property, and that is flex flow. And we can say row and then wrap with a space. And this is going to be the exact same thing as these two lines here. So I can comment that out and it's doing the exact same thing. It's just a shorter syntax, which can be nice because there are so many flex properties that we are setting sometimes. But now that we have multiple rows, we need a way to determine how close the rows are to each other. We initially used align items for this purpose, but as you can see, when we have a flex wrap, align items is just going to align items within their individual row. And if we change this from center to say flex start, we'll see everything gets pushed to the top of their rows, but it doesn't really change how the rows are aligned to each other. The way we can do this is with another property, align content, and we can say maybe center, and this will put the rows all the way in the center. We could also say maybe space between, and this will add some space between them, as well as space around. We'll add space around them, and so on and so forth. These are essentially the same values we've seen with the other flex properties. Now that's pretty much everything there is to flex containers. However, sometimes we need to change how a single flex item is aligning in the group. Maybe we want just one of them to do something a little bit different than the rest. So we have some properties that we can set on the flex items as well to control those individual items and have them do something different than the rest. So for example, let's go down to the red class. And the first property we can look at is called order. And what this says is where in the order do we want this item to be? By default, everything is just ordered in the order that it is in the DOM, but I could say maybe -1 here because the default value is 0. And when I save this, you'll see all of the red ones get pushed to the beginning because they have a value of -1, which is less than the value of everything else. So now we have red at the beginning. We could set this to +1, and red is going to end up all at the end, again, because the default value is 0. So if we go back to 0, it will be what it already was because all of the different flex items have an order of 0, so they're just tying and reverting back to the order that they appeared in the HTML file. And next we can look at this property flex grow. And what flex grow says is if there's extra space, how much of it should this element take up? This defaults to 0, meaning that nothing will take up extra space. This is why we saw initially everything was condensed down to the size of its content. So if I set this to flex grow 1, we will start seeing that when there is extra space, the red elements will take up that space. So in the first line, there is no extra space for the red elements to start taking up, so they're not really changing. But on the second line, the red element had lots of extra space. There was lots of white space on that line. So flex grow here said, okay, I have flex grow 1, none of these other elements have any flex grow, so just let red take up all of the space. And you'll notice that this flex grow has no unit to it. And the reason it is like that is because these are just proportions. So if I said green was also flex grow 1, then what's going to happen is red and green will take up equally the extra space and blue isn't going to take up anything. But if I said maybe green was flex grow 2, then red's going to take up half of the extra space of how much green is taking up because of that proportion of 1 to 2. So now let's remove these flex grow properties for a moment. And I want to look at something very similar, and that is flex shrink. And flex shrink says whether or not this element is able to shrink, which defaults to 1, saying essentially it is able to shrink. But now let's take this green value and let's give it a width. So let's say its width is 100 VW. Now when I save, you'll see green isn't taking up 100 VW. It's just taking up the size of the parent. It's maxing at that size. However, if we change the flex shrink value to 0, saying that this element cannot shrink, it needs to stay its full size, we'll see it goes back to being 100 VW and it's actually overflowing from the flex container. And finally, we also have this property flex basis. So I'm going to change the width to a flex basis. And what this is it's essentially the same thing as width when we're in a flex direction of row. But what flex basis says is this is how much space I want to take up in whatever the main axis direction is. So if this was changed from a flex direction of row to column, then our green elements would get 100 VW in height. But of course, if we go back to row, they go back to having this 100 VW in width. And if we change flex shrink back to 1, then they are going back to just filling up the entire space because that is less than their flex basis width. And with these properties, there's actually a shorthand we can use very similar to the flex flow shorthand we saw earlier. So we can just say flex, and this will be in the order of grow, shrink, and then basis. So for example, here we can say that this is going to have a flex grow of 1, a flex shrink of 0, and a flex basis of 200 pixels, for example. So now we can see these properties interacting with each other. First, we have the flex grow of 1, which says allow the green elements to grow if there's extra space. And then we have the flex shrink of 0 saying that they cannot shrink down to a smaller size than their flex basis of 200 pixels. And since there's more than 200 pixels of space in each of our rows, this is allowing the green element to grow beyond 200 pixels in each row. However, if we change the basis to 2000 pixels, then now it's saying I have a base size of 2000 pixels. I can grow if there's even more space than that, and I am not allowed to shrink. And because there's no room to grow, obviously, and it's not allowed to shrink, this means that the green elements will just display as 2000 pixels and will end up overflowing from our flex container. But now, if we change the flex shrink property back to 1, it's going to say this can shrink, and it's going to shrink the green elements back down to the size of the flex container. That said, let's just move this back to 200 pixels as a flex basis. That way everything fits on the screen a little bit better again. And now that's really all of the Flexbox properties that you will need to know. It's a bit of a learning curve to get used to sort of thinking in Flexbox and thinking about which elements need to be flex containers and which elements need to be flex items, and then which flex properties do we need to set to get elements to lay out exactly how we want them to. But once you do get used to it, it's a super intuitive way to lay out pages, and it's a great way to get very responsive websites because everything's just going to sort of flow and flex, and sizes will change based on how much space there is on the screen. So everything tends to just work really well. So with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS Grid, which is yet another way to lay out content using CSS. And CSS Grid is particularly useful for when we have two-dimensional layouts. While Flexbox was great at laying out elements in a single row or column, especially when we wanted our websites to be flexible and scale naturally with the screen size, CSS Grid will give us similar properties but with more granular control on the exact locations that elements will end up in, especially when we have multiple rows and columns. So to show you how this works, let's get right into an example. Here in this HTML file, we have a body, and inside of the body, we have a header with a H1 that says top level heading. Then we have a main tag with an H2 as well as a paragraph. And then we have an aside tag and a footer tag, each with a paragraph. And you can see all of this in the output on the right, as well as some basic styling we've added. And the goal of this is going to be to change this layout up a bit. And we want the aside content to show up next to the main content. So we want a top level heading at the top, sort of like we have it now. But then below that, we want the main content and the aside content to be in two columns. And then we want the footer content across the bottom. And of course, we could achieve this with Flexbox. It might be a little bit more difficult to figure out how exactly we need to do it, but we could do this with Flexbox. But I hope this example will show the power of CSS Grid and how it's really great for these multi-column layouts. So then in our styles.css, all we have so far is this rule set that is adding a 5-pixel solid light blue border to all of the direct children of the body. And the reason we are doing this is because each of the direct children of the body are going to be our grid items, and this will help us see the borders of the grid. So in this case, we're going to want our grid on the body. This won't always be the case, but for the example here, this is what we will want. So let's take the body and set it to display grid. And what this says is that the body is now a grid container, very similar to setting display flex and how that creates a flex container. So this creates a grid container. And then if we go back to the HTML for a moment, what this will do is it will take each of the direct children of the body, and make them grid items. So the header will be a grid item, main will be a grid item, aside will be a grid item, and the footer will be a grid item. However, anything nested further in the tree will not be grid items. So for example, this H1 is inside of the grid in that it is in the header grid item, but it is not a grid item itself, in the same way as with Flexbox, the flex items are only the direct children of the flex container. Okay, so let's go back to our CSS and start making our grid. So the first property that we usually set will be grid template columns. And what this says is what is going to be the column structure of our grid. How many columns do we want and how large do we want them to be? And the way we set this is with space separated sizes for each column. So for example, I could say 100 pixels, 200 pixels, 100 pixels. So I can save this and we will get a 3-column layout with just that, the 100 pixel left column, the 200 pixel wide center column, and the 100 pixel wide right column. And then you'll see each of the grid items is just placed in a cell, and we get the number of rows by default that we need for each grid item. So since we had 4 grid items and only 3 columns, we end up with 2 rows and the footer content just gets pushed down to the second row. We usually refer to this as an implicit grid because we're allowing the browser to decide for us how many rows we need exactly just based on how many items we have. However, in a moment, we will see how we can change this into an explicit grid by being more explicit about the number of rows we want and where exactly every item should be. So one thing you might notice here already is that we are using pixel values for the widths of these columns, and that's probably not the best thing to do. It's not going to scale super well. So what we can do instead is use this special unit that is a FR, so 1 fractional unit. And what this says is take up as much space as I can, but do it proportional to other FR units. So for example, 1 FR, 2 FR, 1 FR. And when I save, what you'll see this does is it takes up the entire width of the body now, and the middle column is now twice as large as the first column and the third column. Now, one other concern you might have with these fractional units is we don't want one of the columns to get too small. If somebody had a very small browser window and we had lots of columns and maybe one of them was only 1 FR, but one of them was 10 FR, we want to make sure that that one has some minimum size. And the way we can do that is by wrapping this in this function that is min-max, and then we set a minimum value. So maybe we have a minimum of, let's say 200 pixels, and then we add a comma, and then the other value, which is going to be the maximum. And when I save this, you'll see the top level heading column, so the first column, got a little bit wider because 1 FR was not 200 pixels. So if we change this to 20 pixels for a moment, when we save, you can see we still get 1 FR of width, which is a nice behavior here. So it will use the 20 pixel minimum if 1 FR was below that, but otherwise it will just use the 1 FR value. So now for the actual layout we wanted with this website, we said we wanted the header and footer across the entire page, but then the main and aside to be next to each other. So we probably only need 2 columns. So I will erase this, and we will probably want the main to be a bit larger than the aside. So let's say we have 3 FR, 1 FR. And when we save this, you'll see we get 2 columns now, with the one on the left being substantially larger than the one on the right. Next, along with grid template columns, we can also say grid template rows, which is very similar to grid template columns. It just allows us to define the individual rows. So in our case, we need 3 rows, and we probably want the main middle row to be a bit larger than the header and the footer. So let's say the header is going to be 1 FR, the main content will be 3 FR, and the footer will be 1 FR. And when we save this, you'll see now our main content is taking up much more space than the heading content. But we can't even see the third row because there's no content in it yet. There's nothing that's actually being pushed to that third row. But we will see in a moment how to move all of our content around to choose where in this grid it is actually going to be laid out. But first, one other small point I wanted to make is if we had a layout that was something like 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, there's actually a shorthand for this that is super useful. So I just wanted to show it. And that is going to be to add the repeat function. So I could say repeat 3 times and then 1 FR. And this will be the exact same thing as we had before with 3 copies of 1 FR. So as I have it right now, we would have 5 rows each with 1 fractional unit. But I will get rid of this for now and go back to that layout that we had. So there you have our here in the middle. And finally, with relation to columns and rows, one last piece of terminology that you might hear is tracks. And a track is just another word for either a column or a row. So just do know that if you hear the word track, they're referring to either a column or a row within the grid system. But now we need to actually start laying out our elements. And first, let's look at the header. So we can add the header selector, and we need a way to say which columns the header is in. And in this case, we need the header across the entirety of the top of the grid. We want it to be in the first row, but we want it to take up the first and the second column. Now, there are a few ways we can do this, but first let's take a look at grid column start. And what grid column start says is, where does this grid start? Which column? But when we say columns, we're referring to the column lines. So the lines in between the individual columns starting at 1. So in this case, we want it to start at 1. And then we can also add grid column end. And we can say that this will end at column 3. So at the third line, which is the edge of our table, because we have 2 columns, which creates 3 grid lines vertically. And when we save this, you'll see now our heading is spanning the entire top of the page. Alternatively, I can comment out this grid column end for a moment. You'll see this goes back to the layout we had, but we could change this to say span 2. And what this says is take up 2 columns from this spot. So this is now spanning 2 columns. This is doing essentially the same thing we had before. And finally, we could also comment this out, and we can just use the grid column, which is a combination of grid column start and grid column end. So I could say column start of 1, and then we add a / to divide the 2, and then column end of 3. And this is essentially the same thing we had before. These are just different ways to create the exact same output. And similar to grid column, we have all of the same properties with grid row. So I could say grid row of 2, for example, and this would push our heading down to the second row because it is now starting at the second horizontal line. However, we don't actually want this. We want the heading at the top, so I will remove this grid row for now, but just know that that is an option. And we can remove these grid column start and end as well, because we won't need those. We can just use grid column. Now, one thing you might be noticing is that the numbers 1 and 3 are a little bit hard to read. You have to think about that for a moment and say, okay, what is the third grid line? So one thing we can do instead is we can actually give each of the grid lines a name, and then we can refer to them by their names later in the grid columns. So up in the grid template rows, we can add in brackets the names of each line. So for example, we can say left, and this will be left of this first column. And then the line that is in between the 2 columns, we can call middle. And the one on the right of the columns, we can call right. And then we can change this to be left and right. And we could do the exact same thing with the grid template rows. If we were using the row numbers, we could create some names for them and just make it a little bit easier to understand what they all are. But grid rows and grid columns are actually not the only way that we can choose where in the grid system a grid item is displayed. So we can actually go back to this grid container, so the body, and we can add grid template areas. And what an area is it's a rectangular portion of the grid. So it's some subsection of the grid, and we can give each area a name, and then we can just tell the grid items which areas they should be in. And the way we do this is with some strings that are separated by spaces. And usually what we do is we go to a new line, and you'll see why in a moment. It just makes everything a lot easier to read. So we can say at the top, so the first row is going to be our header, but it has 2 columns. So we'll say header, header. So the first 2 columns are both part of the header. Then we can go to a new line here and say that the second row, which we will put in a new string, is going to be our main and then our aside. And then the bottom row we will call our footer, and we will have 2 columns for the footer as well. And now, instead of having this grid column left, right, what we can instead say is that this is going to be in grid area of header. And when we save this, you'll see it does the exact same thing. Personally, I like this grid areas syntax a little bit better because it keeps all of the layout information in one place in the grid container. And then in the individual grid items, all we have to do is define which area they relate to. That said, either syntax is perfectly fine, and there are times when you might want to use one over the other. So next, let's define the grid areas for the rest of these elements. But first, I will also get rid of this grid column because we will not be needing that. So first, we can go to the main and we can say it has a grid area of main. And then we can go to aside. It can have a grid area of aside. And finally, our footer will have a grid area of footer. And when we save this, you'll see we actually get the layout that we want. And this is super nice again because the body, so the grid container, contains the entire layout. So maybe we want the aside on the left instead of the right. And all we would have to do is go up to the grid template areas and switch this order. And now you'll see the aside ends up being the one on the left, whereas main is now on the right. And of course, we would probably want to also change the width of the columns, but you get the idea. So I will undo this and put the aside back for now though. And now I am noticing we're missing a semicolon at the end of the grid template areas, so I will also add that back in. Okay, so that is all there really is to laying out elements in the CSS grid, but there are some other properties we should see that will help us change how the grid is going to look and how the individual items will work within the grid. So first we can add the gap property, and this works just like it does in Flexbox. So I could say gap of 10 pixels, for example, and now you'll see each of our grid items has 10 pixels between them. And again, what's great about this is that because we used these fractional units, even as we add these gaps, everything still fits exactly as you would expect it to. Next, we can also control how the individual grid items will lay out their content. So for example, we can say justify items and maybe center. And what this will do is it will center each of the items and it will no longer stretch them to take up the entire width of the page. We can also do align items center. And this will work very similar to how it does with Flexbox. Now our content will be vertically centered and it only takes up the space of the content. We can also do place items center, which is just a shorthand for justify items and align items. So you'll see if I comment out justify items and align items, we have the exact same output. But for now, I'm going to remove all three of these because we don't actually need those for the layout we were going for. In addition to aligning items and justifying items, you can also do this on an individual item. So for example, I could come down to main and I could say justify self center. And this will center just the main, but it won't affect the other elements. We could also say align self center, and this will now vertically center it and stop that stretching. And we can also do place self center, which again is just the shorthand for doing both of these at once. But again, I will get rid of all three of these because we don't actually need those. Now that's all of the properties that we're going to look at for CSS Grid, but a final point I wanted to make is around nesting. So we can actually nest grids inside of each other, we can nest flex boxes inside of grids, we can nest grids inside of flex boxes, and so on and so forth. So for example, this main section, we could actually make a flex box. So I could set this to display flex, and now main is a flex container as well as being a grid item. And then we could use this just like any other flexbox. So maybe we want to justify content center and align items center. And then we also would probably want to change the flex direction here to column. And now we end up with this vertically and horizontally centered main section. And in general, this is how we will lay out our content. We will use grids for these two-dimensional layouts, and then we can use flex boxes for when we just need single rows and single column layouts. And of course, we can use flex boxes as well for multi-column and multi-row layouts. We just need to be a little bit more careful there because with flex wrap, we have less control over where exactly the wrapping will happen and which elements will be on which line. So with that, that's going to be the end of this video on CSS Grid. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we're going to be discussing images and how we can use them in CSS and when we should use them in CSS instead of the HTML image tag. And at the core of this discussion is the question, are images content or are they style? If they are content, then they belong in the HTML, since that's the markup of our content. But if they are style, then they belong in the CSS, since that is our style sheet. And this is actually going to be the deciding factor that we will be using. Images in HTML should be considered part of the content. If removing an image from the page would change the meaning of the content in any substantial way, then that image probably belongs in the HTML as an image tag. However, if removing the image has no effect on the meaning of the page, then that image likely is just styling information and might belong in the CSS. That said, these aren't absolute rules, and you should always be using your best judgment. Okay, so then how do we actually create an image using CSS? Well, the primary way to do this is with the background image property, which takes a URL function as the value. This function then takes in a path to the image, which can be either relative or absolute. Background image then sets the image to the background of that element, so it will go behind the content if the element has any content. In addition to this background image property, there are also a few properties that can be used to affect the way this background image is rendered. First, the background clip defines where the image will be clipped off or cropped from based on the box model. For example, setting the value to padding box causes the background to extend just outside of the padding, but not to the edge of the border. Similarly, border box would extend to the outside of the border, while content box will only be the size of the actual content. You can also set the value to just text, and the background will only be around the text, but we don't tend to use that one too often because it just doesn't have a lot of use cases. It's also worth noting that the background clip property also works for background colors if we want those to extend to a different portion of the box model. Similarly, background origin sets where the background starts. For example, with padding box, the top left corner of the background image will be the top left corner of the padding. Usually we will end up setting this to the same value as the background clip, but not always. It's also worth noting that the background origin differs in that it cannot have text as a value. Next, background repeat specifies if the background should repeat if the element is larger than the background image. And finally, background size specifies the size of the image. Usually we specify this as two space-separated values, with the first being the width and the second being the height. A value of auto here will scale up the image while keeping its proportions so the aspect ratio doesn't change. Additionally, we can use the values of contain or cover. Cover will scale the image as large as possible, just stretching to fill the container, then cropping out any portions that end up outside of the element. And contain will make the image as large as possible without cropping it or changing the proportions. Now finally, let's take a look at image spriting. And this is the process of including multiple images in a single image file and then splitting up that file on the client before displaying it to the user. Since the client needs to download less files, this can be a great option to be more bandwidth efficient, but at the same time, it can make the code less readable, so there's definitely a trade-off. To actually use the images, you would then use the background position property to get the individual images out of the larger image. This is a property intended to move the background inside of the image container, but combined with some clever sizing on the element, it can also be used to just use a certain portion of the image that you want. And this is great for this image spriting use case. So now let's move over to the code editor and do a quick demo of how this all works. So now we have moved over to the code editor. Let's take a quick look at this demo. So at the top we have an H1 with the text of images, and then we have a div with the ID of AlgoExpert. Below that is some commented out code, but we will take a look at that in a moment. For now, we are just going to focus on this AlgoExpert div. And if we look at the styles.css, you can see the AlgoExpert div is being selected. We give it a width and a height of 300 and 200 pixels respectively. We also gave it a 10 pixel dashed black border and 10 pixels of padding. And most importantly, we've given it a background image of algoexpert.png, which is a local file I have with the AlgoExpert logo. But the first thing you might notice here is that the logo doesn't fit in the box, so it's overflowing and essentially just being cropped so we can only see the top left of the logo. So to fix this, we can set a background size, and what background size does is it allows us to change the X and Y size of the image. So for example, I could set it to 100 pixels by 100 pixels, and now you see we end up with a bunch of these background images because it repeats by default, and 100 by 100 is smaller than the size of the AlgoExpert div. We can also use the keywords we have seen here, so I could say contain, And what contain is going to do is stretch it as large as it possibly can without having to crop or change the proportions of the image. So here we end up stretching it to, I believe, about 200 by 200. I believe this is a square image. And then it is adding a second version of it to the right where it is repeating to fill out the rest of the container. We can also set this to cover, and this will fill out the entirety of the container with however big it has to make it. But then what it's going to do is it's just going to crop the rest of it out. So in this case, since the algoexpert.png file has a different aspect ratio than the size of this div, it's getting cropped at the bottom. So for now, let's go back to a background size of contain, and let's take a look at the repeating background. So we can change that as well by using the background repeat property. So background repeat, and we will set this to no repeat. And what this says is that we only want one copy of this background image. We don't want it to tile and create more copies of it. And next, we can change the background clip and the background origin to decide where this image is going to start. So for example, I can say background origin, and we can set this to either border box, content box, or padding box. So for example, let's set this to the border box, and now the image is starting at the top left of the border rather than starting inside of the border. And similarly, we can set the background clip value. So for example, if I set this to just the content box, then what's going to happen is even though the image is starting at the top left, so at the top of the border, it is getting clipped to the size of the content. So what's happening here is we're actually losing the edges of this image because they're getting clipped, because the background clip is smaller than the background origin box. So usually we end up with these being the same value. So for example, we might want to make this the border box so that they are the same, or we could make them both, say, the padding box, and this will be inside of the border. Okay, so that's how we can use the background image properties. But now what I want to look at is how we can take advantage of this spriting concept that we looked at earlier. So if we go back to the HTML, and let's uncomment out this code, and what we have here is an image that is sprites.png, and this has the HTML and the CSS logos. So the blue logo on the left is the CSS3 logo, whereas the orange logo on the right is the HTML5 logo. And then we have these two sections, each with an H2 of HTML and CSS, and then they each have a div, one with the ID of HTML and one with the ID of CSS. And what I want to do is to make these different divs, so the HTML div and the CSS div, have the images from this sprited image, rather than just using the img tag and seeing both of them next to each other like the sprite file has them. So to do this, let's go back to the styles.css file, and let's start with the HTML image. So I will do the HTML ID, and this image has a size of 256 pixels by 256 pixels. And this is something I just know. If you've created this sprited file like I created this one, you would just need to know what the size of the different images are and the exact locations of those images. And next we need to set the background image. So let's do background image, and we will set this to the URL of the sprites.png file. And next we need to set the background position. And background position will be used to move the HTML logo over because it's currently on the right, but we need to push it over to the left to be on the far left of the image to align with our actual div. So the values we will use here is something that you should just know based on having created the sprite. In this case, we need negative 286 pixels and then negative 10 pixels. And when I save this, you'll see we get the HTML5 logo under the HTML text. Okay, great. So now we can do the same thing with the CSS. So we can say CSS, this has the same width and height, so 256 pixels by 256 pixels. And we can set the same background image as well to the URL of sprites.png. And this one will have a background position of negative 10 pixels, negative 10 pixels. So we just need to move everything left 10 pixels and up 10 pixels. And when we save this under CSS, we now get the CSS logo, but they're both using the same image file. And then in the HTML, we can get rid of the image tag because we don't need it anymore. And now in our final output, we have this div with ID of HTML and div with ID of CSS, but these are being used as images. And now one final step we might want to take is to add an ARIA role to these. So if we have an image that we are just using from CSS, we should give it a role of IMG if this is an image that needs to be considered part of the content. And then we can also give it an ARIA label so that a screen reader would know what this is an image of. So in this case, this would be the HTML logo. And then we can come down to CSS and do the same thing. So we will set this to a role of IMG and give it an ARIA label of CSS logo. And with that, that's going to do it for this video on CSS images. It is sort of a gray area on when you should be using HTML versus CSS. Most of the time, you should probably just be using the IMG, the image tag within HTML, and then editing those tags using CSS just with the width and height properties. But occasionally, you will actually want to use the background image property within CSS for the purpose of a background image. Or you might use it for the purpose of image spriting if you want to minimize the number of files that the user needs to download to their computer to view your website. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing inheritance within CSS. So in this example here, all we have is a main tag, and inside of the main tag we have two tags, an H1 with the text of inheritance, and a button with the text of click me. And then in our styles.css, we have one rule set. This rule set is on the main selector, and we set two declarations. First, the color of red, and the border of 2 pixels solid black. And now if you look at the output, you can see the H1 is being colored red, and then we have this black border that's around the entire main tag, and the button looks just like the default button. Nothing has happened on it. So what's really happening here? Why is the H1 red when it's not even mentioned in the selector? And why is it not getting the border? If it's getting the color, why is it not getting the border? Why is it not just getting all of the values from this rule set or none of them? And if the H1 is being colored red, why is the button not being colored red too? And the answer to all of these questions lies in inheritance as well as the user agent style sheet set by the browser. So in CSS, every property is either an inherited property or a non-inherited property. And what this means is that inherited properties, if they have not been set by a style sheet, will just default to whatever the parent's value is. And because of this inheritance, it will keep going up the tree. So it will be set to the parent's value. But if that parent doesn't have a value, it will set it to the grandparent's value, and so on and so forth until it finds a value that has actually been set. On the other hand, a non-inherited property will only look at the element itself. It will not look up the parent tree to see if another element has set that property. So in this case, color is an inherited property. Border, on the other hand, is not an inherited property, so this is why the H1 is getting the color of red, but it's not getting the border of 2 pixels solid black. And most of the time, this ends up working exactly how we would expect it to, and we don't need to worry about it. Usually we wouldn't want a border to inherit. That would be strange if setting a border on a parent set borders on all of the children. But color, for instance, we probably do want that to be inheriting most of the time, so it makes sense for that to be inherited. However, this doesn't answer the question of the button. Why is the button not red? Because color is an inherited property, so why is it not inheriting it? And to answer this question, let's move over to the Chrome inspector and take a look at this button. So if we open up the body, and then we open up the main tag, we can see the button here. And if we click on it, we can see all of the styles being applied to it. And we haven't set any styles, but we have the user agent style sheet, so the browser defaults, and it's setting a ton of different values. One of the properties it sets is color, and it sets this to the value of a variable internal light dark, which is a Chrome specific variable that will end up being black in this case. So even though color is an inherited property, the button is not inheriting because there is a style sheet that is setting the color. And if we scroll all the way down, you can see all of the inherited values, and it is inheriting the color of red. It's just crossed out because of the fact that it is being overridden by the user agent style sheet. And we can also see the border value here, but it is grayed out, implying that this is not an inherited property by default. So that border is not being used. All this said, within CSS, we can actually change this behavior. So for example, I can come down here and add a button rule set, and we will set this to be color of inherit. So we can set the inherit value on any property in CSS, and this says just go and inherit from my parents even if I'm not an inherited property. And in the case of the color on the button, this is an inherited property by default, but what we can do by setting this to color inherit is we're overriding the user agent style sheet because our color value has a higher level of precedence within the cascade because it's part of the author style sheet. So we end up getting this color inherit, which overrides the color set by the browser, and we end up with red text for the button. And we can even set this inherit value on properties that are not inherited by default. So for example, I could say border inherit, and what this will do is it will get the 2-pixel black border that came from its parent, the main tag, even though that was not an inherited property by default. But for now, I will remove this border and just leave it with color of inherit. Now, in addition to the inherit value that we can set on any property, there are a few other values that work the same way. So for example, I could set this to initial. And what initial says is, don't worry about the user agent style sheet, and don't worry about inheritance, just go look at the actual spec for CSS and do whatever that says. In this case, buttons in the spec just have a black text, so initial is black text. And next we also have the unset value. And what unset says is, if this is an inherited property by default, just inherit. And if it's not an inherited property by default, then go to the initial value from the spec. And the unset value is very useful for undoing what is in the user agent style sheet. So for example, I can say border unset, and this will get rid of the border from the user agent style sheet. And because border is not an inherited property, it will go all the way back to the initial value from the CSS spec, which in this case is to have no border. And finally, there's one more value that we can set anywhere in CSS, and that is going to be revert. And what revert says is just look at the style sheet above me in the cascade. So for example, if we say border revert, since this is the author style sheet, it's going to go back to the user style sheet and say, is there a property border for button in the user style sheet? And if there's not, then it will cascade further to the user agent style sheet, which is why in this case, this is reverting back to the border that was set by the user agent style sheet for the button. And lastly, I wanted to show one property that we can use like these values and that we can use it for any element. So on the button, I can use the all property. And what this says is look at every single property and set all of them to this value. So for example, I can set all of them to unset. And now you can see we have lost all of the user agent style sheet properties except for border, because border we have reverted, which is saying border use the user agent style sheet, but everything else we've unset, which is setting the button back to sort of the defaults as if there was no user agent style sheet. And if I got rid of this border revert, we can see the button is now simply inheriting the color from main, and then all of the other properties just look like standard text, because what we are used to for buttons is actually just from the user agent style sheet. It's not specified in the CSS spec. And again, we can use all for all of these different values. So I could set all of the values to inherit, for example. And now you'll see we are inheriting the border from main because border is one of the properties within all, and color is still unset, but that is also reverting back to the main color of red. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video on inheritance in CSS. Most of the time, we don't need to worry too much about inheritance. It will sort of work how we expect it to, but sometimes you end up in a scenario where something's not looking how you expect it to, and this can come down to the user agent style sheet overriding the values that you thought would be inherited, or it can come down to a property that you thought was an inherited property not being an inherited property. So it's good to know how these rules work. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing responsive design and how we can use CSS media queries to make our websites more responsive and scale better to different screen sizes. So here in this example, we are using a CSS grid layout very similar to the one we saw in the grid video. At the top of the body, we have a header with the H1 top-level heading, and then we have a nav with navigational content, we have a main element with a main heading and a main content paragraph, and then finally we have an aside and a footer, each of which have a paragraph. And then if we go into our styles.css, you can see we have set the body to be display grid, with 3 columns and 3 rows, and then we use grid template areas to define which elements are going to appear in which cells of the CSS grid. Now this output looks fine, it seems to be working, and we've used grid, which we know is a responsive system, and we used the FR unit, which we know is a responsive unit that's going to grow with the size of the viewport. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that our grid layout just won't make sense on a smaller screen. So in Chrome, it gives us the option to choose a screen size within the developer tools, and we can use that to resize this window and see that it's not scaling well at all. It's just sort of zooming out. And if we get small enough, we're not going to be able to see almost anything. Now, of course, nobody's going to have a 50 pixel wide phone or browser window, but the idea is there that the smaller that the screen is getting, the worse that this output is starting to look. So let's see if we can fix that. The first thing we need to do is actually to go back to our HTML file. And in the head of our HTML file, we need to add a meta tag. And we saw this meta tag in the HTML crash course, and we can give it a name of viewport. And what this meta tag is going to do is define the way that the viewport is going to scale. So we can say content equals width, and this width is going to be device width. So we're saying that we want the width of the screen to be whatever the width of the device is, and we want the initial scale to equal 1. And we can go to a new line here as well, just so that things are a little bit easier to read. And again, we talked about this meta tag in the HTML crash course, so I'm not going to go too in depth on it here. But as a reminder, this is simply a way to tell the browser that I wrote responsive CSS, and I want that responsive CSS to be honored rather than just zooming out the screen as a user's browser gets smaller and smaller. But with that in mind, we have to actually write the responsive CSS. So now let's come back over to our styles.css file. And what we need to do is add media queries. And what a media query does is it lets us say that we want to run a piece of CSS based on a condition. And usually these conditions are minimum and maximum screen sizes, but there are actually a ton of different media queries that we can use. But that said, here we are going to be focusing on the size of the screen. So down here at the bottom of our CSS file, we can add our first media query, and we'll use the @ sign and then media. And then in parentheses, we will say what the condition is. And in this case, let's say that we want a max width of 800 pixels. So if the user's browser is smaller than 800 pixels, we will go into this media query. But if it's over 800 pixels, this condition will be false, and we will just move on and not run this code at all. So in the case that the user has a smaller device, so smaller than 800 pixels, we want to change the way that our grid layout is working, and that is on the body tag. So inside of the media query, we will add a body selector, and then we can change the grid layout. So I'm actually going to go back up to the body tag and just copy the grid layout code, and we can paste it down here into this body tag and change it how we want. And usually what we end up doing on smaller screens is making it a single column layout. So for now, what I'm going to do is make this just one column. So one FR as the only column, and then we need to make the rows reflect the sizes of the different rows we will want. So let's say that the header is going to be first as one FR, and then we'll have the navigation element below it also one FR, and then we can have the main content still be 3 FR, and then we can have the aside go below that with 1 FR, and the footer as 1 FR below that. And next we can change the grid template areas to reflect that. So first we have the header. Below the header, we will have the nav. Below the nav, we will have main. Below main, we will have our aside. And finally, at the bottom, we will have our footer. And now we can save this, and you'll see nothing has changed. But if I resize the browser window, once it gets below 800 pixels, you'll see it'll flip to using the single column layout that is following what we said in the media query. And next, we can actually start combining media queries. So we can use multiple media queries on the same page based on different screen sizes. So I'm going to add another media query below here, and this one's going to be for even smaller screens. So let's set a max width on this one and say this one's going to be 600 pixels. And inside of this 600 pixel max width, we want to be even more concise with what we show the user. And if we look at our output, we can't make it less columns anymore because we only have one column, But what we can do is actually hide some information. So for example, the aside, we know just based on the fact that this is an aside tag, this content's not that important. So we might want to just not show it. And of course, there's a content design debate to be had here about whether or not we should be hiding information just based on a user's screen size, and really we should probably be showing it in a better way. But for the purpose of demonstration, let's go ahead and hide these aside tags on these very small screens. So we could do display none to completely remove that aside from the page, and then we will need to fix our grid as well to reflect this. So we can also add our body tag here, and then we can copy the grid template rows and the grid template areas and paste them into this body tag, except the only difference is we will remove the aside and we will remove the row for the aside and the grid template rows. And now when we save this, you'll see at the smaller screen size, we aren't even showing the aside, but as I make the screen bigger, eventually the aside will show back up, and then as the screen gets even bigger, it will go back to our 3-column layout. And if we did go back to the HTML file for a minute and comment out this meta tag we added just to show what exactly this is doing, now if we were to scale down this browser, you'll see it doesn't actually change. It doesn't use the media queries at all really, because as the browser window is getting smaller, what tends to happen is it just zooms out the page for you. But when we include this meta tag, our media queries will be completely working as we expect. So as a general debugging tip, if you are adding a bunch of media queries and they don't seem to be doing anything, a first thing to look at is, do you have this viewport meta tag added to make sure that it is respecting your responsive design? And finally, I wanted to talk about a concept known as mobile first design. And mobile first design essentially means to build a website that is optimized for mobile first, and then we can use media queries to make it work on larger browser windows second. And this is the opposite of what we have done here. In our styles.css, in the body tag, we set up the grid for a larger screen, and then we used the media queries at the bottom to affect smaller screens. And this is fine. There's nothing wrong with doing it this way, but the idea of mobile first design is sort of twofold. One, it's that if something is optimized for mobile, it will scale up to a larger screen naturally, better than something optimized for a large screen will scale down to mobile. And also, more and more of the internet is being consumed on mobile phones, so it makes sense to optimize for those first. So if we wanted our CSS to follow this mobile first design principle, one thing we could do is we could take our grid template for mobile and we can just move it into the main body tag up here. And then we can take the larger screen setup for our grid and we can move it down into our media query. And we'll remove this columns as well. And then we can change this max width to a min width. So now we are saying if there's a minimum width of 800 pixels, so if we are larger than 800 pixels, go into this media query. And then at the bottom, we can just leave this max width of 600 pixels for now. But you could imagine if you had built this website with mobile first in mind, you might have built this version first and then used media queries for each incrementally larger website. And you'll see the output for this will actually work the exact same. Nothing is going to be any different. All we have done here is just moved some CSS around, but of course, if we wanted this to be an actual mobile first design, we would have designed the mobile website first, and then from there worked on the larger screen size versions. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video on responsive design. CSS media queries are super powerful, and there's a lot you can do with them to make amazing websites. So I highly recommend you are using them as often as possible to make sure that all of the websites you build are responsive on as many device screen sizes as possible. So I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be looking at how we can create animations using just pure CSS. So if we take a look at this example, all we have is a div with the text animations inside of it. And then if we go to our styles.css, we're just adding a few styles to the div to make it easier for us to see. So we have a light blue background color, we give it a width of 30%, a height of 6 EM, a border radius of 12 pixels to round the corners, 12 pixels of padding, as well as 4 EM of margin just to push it away from the edge of the screen. Now, if we want to create a CSS animation, there are two different ways we can do this. First is with the transition property, and what the transition property does is it allows you to transition from one property value to another. So for example, we could take our width and we could expand it to a larger width, and then there would be a smooth transition between those values. And second, we have the animation property, which gives us a bit more granular control of how everything is working. But let's start by making a transition. So what I want is for the width of this div to change, but only when it's been hovered. So let's say div with the pseudo class of hover, we want to change the width. So let's make the width, say 50%. Now when I hover my mouse over the div, you see it gets bigger, and then when I let my mouse off, it gets smaller, which this is what we expect with the CSS we wrote. But I want this to be smoother. I don't want it to just jump to those values. I want it to smoothly transition from one value to the next, and we can do that with the CSS transition property. To go ahead and create that transition, we will come back up to this div rule set, and we can add a new declaration for the transition property. So transition property says, what are we going to transition on? Which property value pair do we care about? In this case, it is width. And then we can also add a transition duration to say how long do we want this to take. For example, let's say 1 second, which we just use the letter S for. And when I save this, now if I hover over the animation, you'll see it slowly transitions over 1 second in both directions. So anytime the width value is changing, we get this smooth transition. Now on top of these two properties, there are two other properties that we can define with transition. So first we have the transition timing function. And what a timing function is it defines how exactly this is going to happen. Is it going to be perfectly smooth and linear, or should it ease in and then ease out, or maybe something completely different? And there's a few different keywords we can use here. For example, linear, we'll make this a linear timing function. So the speed will never change. It will linearly go from 30% width to 50% width. And now if I hover over the div, you'll see it is expanding in a linear fashion, meaning that the speed is constant. However, I could change this back to ease, which is the default value, and now you'll see it will sort of increase in speed in the middle, and the same thing in reverse. And there are a few different timing functions we can use, as well as we can create custom ones using the cubic Bezier, and we will see that all in a moment, but for now we will leave this on ease. And finally, we have one last property here, which is the transition delay. And what this says is how long to wait until running the transition. So for example, I can say 1 second here. So now if I hover over the div, you will see it takes 1 second before running the transition. And the same will happen when I remove my mouse from the div. It will take 1 second before running that transition. And finally, there is a shorthand notation we can use here. So we can simply say transition, and then set the transition property, followed by the duration, the timing function we want, and then the delay we want. And this will do the exact same thing as this code here. So I'll go ahead and comment this out. So now you might have the question of what if I wanted to transition more than one property, not just the width? For example, if we come down to hover and we say we also want to add a transform property, and transform is a property that we use a lot with transitions and animations. It allows us to just move elements around on the page. And maybe in this case, we want to rotate and say 180 degrees. And when we save this, it's not going to work just yet because our transition is only transitioning the width. So there's two ways we can solve this. One, we could set this to all, which would just say transition every single value that changes, or we can use a comma separated value. So I could say width and then comma, and then what we want for the transform. So we can say transform, and then we just set the same values again. So for example, maybe I want the duration on this one to also be 1 second. I want the timing function to also be ease, but I want the delay to be 0. And we could also just leave off the delay, but I'll add 0 explicitly here. And now we will have two different transitions. So we will have the width transition will take 1 second. And then we have the transform transition, which will also take 1 second, but it will happen first because it has no delay, whereas the width transition has a 1 second delay. And now if I hover over the animation, we'll see it rotates first, and then it changes the width. And if I remove my mouse, we'll see it rotates back, and then it changes the width back, because the rotation will always happen first, because that is the one that has no delay on it. Now that is all there really is to CSS transitions. They're very straightforward and easy to work with, but at the same time, they are very powerful and usually can account for most of the animation type effects that we want, especially when we want an animation based on a state, which is usually the hover state, but not always. It can be different states, and it can also be controlled by JavaScript. So maybe a button is clicked, and then we add some CSS class that creates this transition for us. However, sometimes we do need more granular control than that, and we need a little bit extra functionality, and for that we can use the animation property. So I will remove these transition properties, and let's start looking at how we can create animations. So to create an animation, we will come down here and do @keyframes, and then we give it a name. So for example, let's just call this move. And then we can open the keyframes using the curly braces. So now within these keyframes, we define what all of the different values will be for the animation at different points in time. So for example, 50% of the way through the animation, let's add a transform property. And let's say 50% of the way in, it is transformed to translate, which is just going to move it in both the X and Y direction. Let's say we've moved it in the X direction 200 pixels, but maybe we haven't moved it in the Y direction at all. Next, from here, we can add another keyframe. So let's say at 100%, so the end of the animation, we want a transform property, and we want this one to translate as well. But let's change the values once again. So maybe here, we still want 200 pixels on the X, so our X axis isn't going to change in the end of the animation, but we want to move down on the Y axis. So let's say 300 pixels on the Y axis. And we can save this. And now we need to come back up to our div, and we need to define the animation property to say which animation are we using. So we can use animation name first to choose which animation we want, and we called it move. And then we can give it an animation duration, which let's say that this is going to take 3 seconds. And now when I save this, you'll see the animation will run, moving the div over 200 pixels, and then it moves it down 300 pixels, and then once the animation is done, it just returns back to its starting point. However, we might want the element to stay at the ending value from the animation rather than jumping back to where it was. And the way we can do this is with animation fill mode, which is a property that allows us to do just that. Choose if the element will stay where it ended, and as well at the beginning of the animation if it should jump to where it is supposed to start from or if it should just already be there. So we can say forwards here, and what this will do is it will keep the value at the ending point of the keyframes. So at the end of the animation, the element stayed with a translate property of 200 pixels and 300 pixels rather than jumping back to where it started. Next, there are a few other properties that we can take a look at. So for example, we could do animation direction, which will choose which direction it animates in. So I could say reverse, and now you'll see it animates in the opposite direction from what it was doing before. We can also set an animation iteration count, which says how many times to run the animation. So for example, if I set this to 2, it will now run this animation twice rather than just running it once, and then after those 2 times, it will stop animating. We can also change this to a value of infinite, and what infinite does is it just runs the animation indefinitely. So as long as this page is open and the CSS is not changed, this animation will just keep running, but I'm going to change this back to a value of, let's say 2, and just have it run twice. Next, we can set what we call the animation play state, and this is either paused or running. So if we set it to running, it's going to do exactly what we expect. It's going to continue running the animation. But if I change this to paused, it's going to stop the animation where it was changed to paused. And this is super useful with JavaScript. If we ever want to stop an animation, have a button that the user can click and stop it, we can add this animation play state property via JavaScript. But we don't tend to use this directly in CSS too often, because if we don't have some JavaScript to change the value, then it's either just not going to play at all, or it's going to be the default state of running. But I can go ahead and switch this back to running so that our animation can run again. And finally, just like we could with transitions, we can set a timing function. So we will use the animation timing function, and we will set this to the same values that we could use in transitions. So for example, I could set this to linear, and now we will get a linear timing function, as well as I could use a different value like ease in, ease out, etc. We can also create custom timing functions using the cubic Bezier function. And I'm not going to go into the exact mathematics behind this function because you usually won't be expected to know it in detail, and likely you will use the developer tools to come up with a good set of values. But to briefly explain, this refers to a function on the XY plane. The steeper the slope in the function, the faster the animation will run at that portion of the animation. And these functions default to a linear function with 2 points, one being the origin and the other being 1, 1. And then in the cubic Bezier CSS function, we define 2 sets of XY coordinates in the range of 0 to 1 that determine the rest of the points that make the shape for the function. So for example, we can set the first point to 0.2, 0.6, and the second point to 0.6, 0.2, and this will create a somewhat interesting function that slows down in the middle. So now when I save this, you'll see the animation changes to follow this new timing function curve. All this said, I wouldn't worry too much about cubic Bezier. You should know what it is and its purpose, but most of the time you won't be coming up with these values by hand. And finally, along with the cubic Bezier, we can also use a steps function. And what the steps function does is it allows us to just say how many steps there should be between the values rather than doing a smooth transition. So for example, steps of 3, and we can see now the element is just sort of jumping across the screen rather than it smoothly transitioning between the values. And now lastly, with animations, we do have a few shorthands that we can use, just like we did with transitions. So instead of using this entire set of properties, we can just use the animation property, and then this will take the name. So in this case, it was called move, and then we can add all of the values. So the first time that you add will be the duration. So we can say 3 seconds, then we can add the various values. And then we had a iteration count of 2, it was running, and we wanted steps of 3. And we'll see that this is now the exact same thing. So I can comment this out and we get the exact same animation that we had before, because again, this is just a shorthand notation for these values. And lastly, there is some shorthand notation within the keyframes as well. So rather than 100%, we can call this 2. And we can also add a value that is from, and from will be equal to 0%. So for example, we could say from and add one more property here, and maybe this one will just be 0 pixels, 0 pixels, and it is going to do essentially the same thing we had before, except now we're using this from and to value to equal 0 and 100%. So that's going to do it for this video on CSS animations and transitions. They are incredibly powerful tools that we get just with CSS alone, so I hope you did find this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS variables, or custom properties as they are more formally known. And CSS variables are simply a way for us to give names to values in CSS. That way we can remove the redundancy of having the same values throughout our CSS files, and just have them in one place and reuse the names throughout. So to look at this example here, first we have a header with the h1 of CSS variables, and then we have a main tag. Inside of the main tag we have 2 sections, each with an h2, so section 1 and section 2. And then if we come over to our CSS, you can see we have the h1 rule set where we give it a text color of this hex value here. And then we have an h2 rule set where we give it some padding and the font color of white. And then we have the main tag, which we set to be display of flex. We give it a 5 pixel solid black border, 12 pixels of gap between the flex items, which will be the 2 sections, then a width of 412 pixels. And finally, we have the sections, which have a flex basis of 200 pixels, which remember will essentially act like a width in this case. Then we have a flex shrink and grow of 0, saying we do not want these sections to grow or shrink, we want them to stay at 200 pixels. Then we set a background color to the same value that we used for the color of the h1. So if we look at the output, you can see the 2 sections have the same background color, that dark blue color, as the CSS variable's text has for a font color. So then the question is, what issues do we see with this CSS file? Well, there's a few of them. For one, we have this color in 2 places, and that's not the best thing to be doing. You could imagine if we had a huge CSS file for a massive website, and we had some main color that was the main website color. We don't want that to be all over the CSS file, because what if we want to change it? It will be a bit of a pain to change it, especially if it is all over a bunch of different CSS files. So what we can do instead is we're going to want to have a variable to give a name to this color. That way we only have to use the color one time. And then we also have this width of 412 pixels, which is a very exact value, and it's not very clear what this is. Well, what it actually is it's the flex basis of each section, so the width of the 2 sections, multiplied by 2, and then added the gap in there as well. So we need a way to calculate that, because what would happen if this flex basis were to change? Maybe these are changed to 100 pixels. Now the main is too big for its content. And as a bit of a disclaimer, there are other ways we could have created this layout and avoided this issue, but for the purpose of demonstration, let's see how we can keep this 200 pixels hard-coded flex basis as well as this width and still have everything working. So first, let's create a CSS variable, and the way we usually do this is on the root pseudo class. So we can say root, and then we will define our variables here. The reason we do this is because we want our variables to be accessible in the entire document, and the root pseudo class does just that. You can also use the HTML tag here, and it will do the same thing. We can also make our variables specific to portions of the DOM if we wanted, but that tends to be a little bit less common. The most common thing you'll see is this root pseudo class. So to define a variable, we give it 2 dashes at the start of its name and then just the name. So I'll call this one main color, and then we can just put in whatever value we want. For example, this value here, we can copy it and add a semicolon, and that will create a main color variable. Next, to use the variable, we can copy the name, and then we will just replace this value with a call to the var function, and then the name inside, including the 2 dashes. You'll see nothing will change. This works exactly as before. We can copy this down here to this background color here, and we will get the exact same output once again. But what's cool now is if we ever need to change this, we can change the main color to say red, and now all of the values using that main color will shift with it. We won't have to change it in multiple different places. But for now, I will go back to this color we had. It's a little bit easier to look at. And next, let's try to solve the issue of this width. So we probably don't want a 412 pixel exact width. That's a little bit strange. We want to be calculating this value. So first, let's remove some of the hard-coded values that are making up the width. So first, we had that flex basis of 200 pixels. So let's call this section size, and we will make this 200 pixels. Then we can copy this name, and we can paste it into the flex basis. We will call variable section size. And the other component to this width was the gap. So we can call this maybe flex gap 12 pixels. And then instead of this 12 pixel value here, we'll say var flex gap. Add a semicolon. And again, nothing will change because we are just adding names to these values. We haven't actually changed any values. And now the width, we need to actually calculate this. And what we can use is this calc function. And the calc function allows you to add up values, and it's really cool because you can even add up values of different units. So for example, I could say 100 pixels plus 20 VW, and this would calculate that width for me. But that's not what we want here. What we want here is to actually use these values or the variables that we have saved. So we can say the variable for the section size, and we want to multiply that by 2. And that will give us a good start, but you'll see it's not quite large enough. And the reason for that is because we need to also add in the space for that flex gap. So we can just add the variable of flex gap here. And now you'll see we get exactly what we want because this width is now being calculated as the section size multiplied by 2 because we have 2 sections. And we could even go a step further if we wanted and try to factor that number 2 out as well. But for now, I will leave it there. And then we are adding in the gap between the elements. And now one last thing I wanted to demonstrate is that this root pseudo class, if we were to change it to say main, for example, this would now only affect things nested inside of the main tag. So the header is no longer affected. And if I make this color red again, so it's easier to see, you can see the font color of the header is not changing because this is only affecting things that are inside of the main tag. But again, I will go back to root. And the last point I did want to make is that this is something that comes with CSS by default, but you might also see CSS variables through the form of Sass or less or one of the other preprocessors, and that is perfectly fine, and there are use cases for that as well as for these, but this is the one that comes with CSS by default, so I wanted to show this in the video here. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS frameworks and preprocessors. To set the expectations here, we won't be discussing individual frameworks in any great detail, but rather we will be looking at the high-level similarities and differences between them. Oftentimes, you will hear the word framework as a fairly generic term, but really there are 2 categories of tools we are discussing here. First, a CSS framework is simply pre-written code that we can use in our projects to speed up development. This usually comes in the form of pre-written style sheets or pre-built components. A preprocessor, on the other hand, is a way to add functionality to the language. The browser only understands pure CSS, but preprocessors are programs that convert some other code into CSS for us, to essentially add some nice features to the language. This can be a great way to speed up development and also allows us to write good high-quality code that is easy to maintain. Now first, let's take a look at some of the most common frameworks. Again, we won't be diving deep into the implementation of these frameworks. The purpose of this video will simply be to understand the high-level differences between them. Okay, so first up is Tailwind, and this is a framework that provides some customizable utility classes that we can use in our HTML that give us pre-made CSS. For example, we could use it to make sure we are being consistent with our own design system. So as an example of this, it can create classes for us of each of the different background colors that we might be using on our website. Then we can add those classes to the HTML elements that need them, and they will have the background color, and we won't have to write that CSS manually. As a result, when we use Tailwind, we tend to not have to write much CSS at all, and it becomes very easy to build consistent designs that are responsive. On the other hand, this heavy use of classes can deter some people from using it, as they might feel like the styling information is being all put inside of HTML, and this can cause the HTML files to get a little bit harder to read. That said, it is a great option, and it's used very frequently throughout the industry. Next up, we have Bootstrap, and Bootstrap is arguably the most popular CSS framework, and it has been for some time. It was originally developed by Twitter with the intent of developing consistent designs that were responsive. It comes with a variety of pre-built components that you can use to quickly get a professional-looking website with very little effort. That said, due to its popularity, you'll want to be careful about using these pre-built components in their basic form without customization, because it can tend to make your website look like every other Bootstrap website rather than having its own style. Bootstrap also has an incredibly powerful grid layout system. It's somewhat similar to the built-in CSS grid, and it can make building high-quality layouts extremely easy. One other downside to be aware of with Bootstrap is that it does mean adding a very large CSS file to your website. This can slow down page load times, and it also means it can be difficult to customize some of the components, as you might need to do some searching to see what properties you need to actually override. And next we have Materialize, which is a very similar framework to Bootstrap. However, it is based on the Google Material UI design system. Similar to Bootstrap, this framework has its own grid-based layout system, and it comes with many pre-built, high-quality, responsive components that you can use directly in your websites to give them a professional feel right out of the box. The original Material UI design system developed at Google was inspired by the concept of a paper and ink, and they focused on making designs that felt familiar even while on a screen. And this design system has been extremely successful for them at Google. The biggest drawback here could also be stated as being its biggest strength, and that's that your websites will need to follow the Google Material UI design system throughout to be consistent with these components. In general, this is a very strong, well thought out design system, but it's just something to keep in mind as you customize Materialize components. You will want to stay consistent with their principles. Moving on, Foundation is yet another extremely popular CSS framework with a variety of pre-built UI components and a grid system for responsive design. Oftentimes, Foundation can be a bit easier to customize than some of the other CSS frameworks, but that's not to say that the other ones can't be customized, or that Foundation is the only one with that ability. Usually the biggest deciding factor between these three frameworks or any of the other ones out there will simply be which has the design system that best fits into the style of the website you are looking to build. Finally, Bulma is probably the least popular on this list, but it is unique in that it is a CSS-only framework. Most CSS frameworks require that you include some of their JavaScript code on your website, but Bulma doesn't do this. This means that Bulma is less opinionated about the implementation of your components, as it is purely focused on assisting with the styling. That said, it also means that there will be more work to get everything up and running, as you will need to write more JavaScript code than you might need to with some of the other framework options. All that said, These are just a few of the CSS frameworks out there, and there are tons more of them to explore. However, most of them do tend to be extremely similar to each other, just with a few specific pros and cons to compare before choosing which one might be right for your project. Now let's take a look at preprocessors. There aren't quite as many of these out there, but there are still a ton of options to choose from. By far the most popular of these options is Sass, which is a language extension to CSS, providing its own syntax for some extra functionality. For example, it includes variables, mix-ins which allow you to reuse blocks of code, the ability for classes to extend one another, nesting syntax instead of needing complex combinators, looping syntax, and a ton more. Less is very similar to Sass, although it is a bit less popular of an option. Arguably the biggest difference between the two is that Sass uses Ruby, while Less is written in JavaScript. That said, the more important differences will be the syntax, because largely they have very similar features, just with different syntax for how you write the code to use those features. Next, Stylus is another preprocessor option that is very similar to Sass in functionality, just with different syntax again. One of its biggest focuses is on making the syntax simple, so it makes just about all punctuation marks such as braces, colons, semicolons, and commas completely optional. Many developers coming from a Python background tend to find Stylus an appealing option for this reason, since CSS syntax becomes much more similar to Python when you use the Stylus preprocessor. Finally, PostCSS is a bit of a different option. It is another JavaScript-based tool, but with a much higher focus on customizability. It comes with a variety of plugins, and you can choose which plugins you want to use to transform your CSS, almost like building your own preprocessor for your specific projects. For example, one of the plugins will parse your CSS and add any vendor-specific prefixes needed to make your CSS work on various versions of different browsers. And this is just one of the many plugins that you have as an option when you use PostCSS. Okay, so now let's answer the big question. Should you be using frameworks and preprocessors? And of course, the answer is, it depends. For frameworks, this really depends on the projects that you are working on. For projects with smaller teams or shorter deadlines, I would almost always say yes, use frameworks to help speed up your development and focus on features rather than reinventing the wheel. However, as projects scale up, there can be value in building out your own components to make your website feel unique and fully customized. That said, for these large projects, you can still use frameworks, and many huge companies are. You'll just want to make sure that you are putting in substantial work to customize those components to fit in with your own style and brand. On the side of preprocessors, I think the answer here is oftentimes a bit easier. Usually, yes, I would recommend them. Sass tends to be the most popular option, but any preprocessor will make your CSS easier to write, more maintainable, and less likely to contain bugs. That said, there's nothing wrong with using pure CSS instead of using a framework or a preprocessor. Additionally, if you're just learning CSS or trying to brush up on your skills, I would say don't use any frameworks or preprocessors and focus on the fundamentals of the language rather than having these tools abstract those things away from you. And then of course you can learn the tools after you feel comfortable with the fundamentals of CSS. And with all that said, that's going to be the end of this video on CSS frameworks and preprocessors. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing CSS, or cascading style sheets. CSS has two primary purposes. First, it allows us to style our websites by adding colors, fonts, and much more that we'll see throughout the crash course. Moreover, it allows us to describe the layout of how we want our website to be presented, such as the size and positioning of elements. A style sheet is simply a document that does just that. It allows us to describe the style and layout of a website. And the cascading portion of the name refers to the order of which the browser decides between various style sheets. Specifically, there are three main types of style sheets. First, the user agent style sheet defines the browser defaults. For example, this contains the default font sizes for the different heading levels. Next, the user style sheet contains any of the user's saved preferences in the browser. These override the user agent style sheet. Finally, the author style sheet contains the CSS that the author of the website writes. So these will be what we are primarily writing, and they take precedence over all of the other style sheets. However, it is worth noting that other style sheets can still take precedence if they use the important rule, which we will see later in the crash course. That said, we can usually assume that our styles will have the highest level of precedence. CSS is simply a collection of declarations, which are just property value pairs describing the styles of our website. Occasionally, you will also hear declarations referred to as individual rules. The syntax of a declaration is extremely simple. First, we write the property name, followed by a colon, and then the value. Finally, lines end with semicolons. For example, to change the font color to red, we would just use the color property, followed by a colon, then the word red, and a semicolon. Next, we need a way to tell CSS what elements we want to style, and we do that by including our declaration in what we call a rule set. Rule sets have two primary components, the selector and the declaration block. The selector determines which elements should be affected by this rule set. For example, here we are selecting all H1 and paragraph tags. We will see in a future crash course video more about the options we have here for selectors. Then inside the curly braces is the declaration block. And this is simply a collection of these declarations that we have already seen. It's worth noting that the last declaration technically does not need a semicolon, but it's always advised to include it. Next, we might want to include comments in our CSS, just like any other language. And comments have a very simple syntax. First, a forward slash, followed by the asterisk character, and then the actual contents of the comment, and then the comment is ended with another asterisk character and a forward slash. Comments can be one or multiple lines, but they always use this same syntax regardless of how long they are. And finally, we need to actually link our CSS back to the HTML files we write. The way we do this is through the link tag, which goes in the head since it does not affect the actual markup of the page. This takes two primary attributes. First, the rel or relationship attribute. This says what the relationship of the linked document is to the HTML, and in this case, we want style sheet. Next is the href or hypertext reference, and this works just like other HTML href attributes that we have seen. It is the path to the CSS file, either relative or absolute. It is pretty common to call this file something like styles.css, but the name is really up to you. And that's really all there is to the core of CSS. It's quite a simple language. So now let's move over to the code editor and do a quick demo. Now we are here in the code editor, so let's go ahead and write some CSS for this basic website. All it does is it says hello world and then H1, and then it has a paragraph that says I am a paragraph. The first thing we need to do is actually link the CSS file. So we'll do this at the bottom of the head. We'll add a link tag, and the link tag will take two primary attributes, rel for the relationship, and this will be style sheet. And then we need an href to actually link back to the file, and this will be styles.css. And this is a self-closing tag. Save that, and now we can go into our styles.css file and start writing some CSS. So first we need a selector, so let's select the H1 for now, and we can write some styles for the H1. So we'll open up a rule set and we can add some declarations. The first thing I notice here is that my text is all off to the left, and I might want to center it. And the way we can center text is with the text align property, and we'll set that to be center. Save that, and we'll see we have our first CSS declaration working. It is centering the text hello world. But I also might want to change its color. The black text is a little bit boring, so maybe let's say color, which sets the font color, and let's make this a dark blue. Save that, and you can see now we have dark blue text. There are lots of different colors we can use here by name, as well as you can enter colors in a few different formats, and we'll see all of that in the video on units, but for now, we'll just put dark blue. Additionally, maybe I don't want this font to be quite so bold, so the way we can change that is do font weight, which defaults to bold for a heading, but maybe I want to make this normal instead, so now it's no longer bold, but this doesn't feel quite as important as I want it to be, so let's also underline it. The way we can underline is using text decoration, and we can set this one equal to underline. Save that, and now we have our heading is dark blue. It is a normal font weight rather than being bold, and it is underlined in the center of the page. So now let's make some changes to the paragraph as well. So we can just add another rule set down below this one. The convention is usually to add one blank line between each rule set, and then we can make some changes to the paragraph. Maybe first I want to add a background color to it. So let's say background color, and we can make this the same dark blue that we used above. And now the paragraph has this dark blue background. But accessibility wise, this is obviously a problem. I can barely even read the paragraph now. So let's change the font color of this one as well and maybe make it white. So usually when we have a dark background, you want to use white font or a very light colored font. Next, let's add a height. So we can say height and then we can set it to some value, maybe 100 pixels, and this will just make the entire thing bigger. There are other options for how we can set height. There's a bunch of different units, and we will see those as well in the future crash course videos, but for now, we'll just go with 100 pixels. But we might actually want to change this away from a height into what we call min height. And min height will do the same thing in this instance, but it's a little bit more accessible. The reason being it doesn't set the exact height, it just sets a minimum. So in the case the user was using a larger default font size than we were when we were building the website, this min height will allow that paragraph to still get taller than the 100 pixels if theirs needs to stretch even bigger. And on the note of font size, we can change that as well, and we can use the font size property for this, and we can set it equal to some value. There are a bunch of different units that we can use for this. The one I prefer to use most of the time is REM, so I'll set it to 1.25 REM, which is the root EM unit. Essentially what this will do is it will set it to 1.25 times the size of the root element's font, which the root element is the HTML tag. And by default, this will be 16 pixels in most browsers, but this allows users to change it, and our font size will scale with how they changed their defaults, as opposed to if we just used a pixel value here, we would be setting it to a pixel value that cannot change no matter what the user has done in their defaults. So I think this is usually a little bit better is to use REM. And then maybe we also want to change the width of this. So we could say width, and let's just make it 30%. So this will do 30% of the size of its parent, which in this case happens to be the body. So it is 30% the size of the entire page. Now, of course, we will continue to see more properties, values, and selectors throughout the entirety of the CSS crash course, as well as Front-End Expert as a whole. But for now, this will end this video on the basics of CSS. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS methodologies and best practices. The ultimate goal here will be to try to answer the high-level question of what is good CSS? Or in other words, how do we write CSS that scales to large projects while still being easy to maintain? We will look at a variety of different popular methodologies in this video, but first, let's take a look at some of the general principles most of these methodologies focus on. First, and most importantly, we want to be consistent. It should be easy to find code in your codebase, and you should be able to easily assume what classes might exist for a given component. Next, we usually want to minimize how much our CSS is intruding on the HTML. The optimal outcome here would be that we had an HTML file that looked like raw markup with no styling information whatsoever. But as you will see, many of the methodologies will make sacrifices here in favor of other benefits. Within our styles, we also want to focus on responsive designs and minimizing usage of any absolute values. This will ensure that our websites are properly scaling regardless of the devices that a user is using to view the website. Moreover, we will want to respect the cascade of CSS and avoid using any important rules. This will help prevent us from writing CSS hacks that oftentimes just have better solutions. You will see some methodologies solve this by minimizing the differences in specificity between selectors, but we can also just ensure that we are using the cascading and specificity rules as they were intended by the CSS spec. Finally, we usually want to minimize redundant code. This is oftentimes referred to as don't repeat your code or the dry principles. To do this, we can use variables for repeated styles and group similar components with common classes. Okay, so these are all great principles to follow, but now let's take a look at some specific implementations of these principles through methodologies. First, we will look at the block element modifier methodology, or BEM as it is usually referred. This is a methodology that breaks CSS down into three categories: blocks, elements, and modifiers. Blocks are standalone entities with independent meaning. For example, if we had a menu, we could call that a block. We then select blocks by using class names based on the name of the block, such as the class menu. Next, elements are part of a block with no standalone meaning. For example, in the menu, a single item could be an element. We select these with class names that are the name of the block, then two underscores, and then finally the name of the element. For example, we could say menu and then have two underscores, and then item for the name of that menu item class. Finally, modifiers are for small flags on elements to change little pieces of style or provide variants such as disabled or selected states. These can modify either elements or blocks, and they are denoted by adding two dashes to the class name followed by the modifier name. For example, here we have the same menu block, but we also gave it the menu disabled modifier. You'll notice that we do include both the name of the block and the name of the modifier as two separate classes, separated by spaces as per standard HTML syntax. Similarly, we can add the selected modifier to a menu item with menu item, and then two dashes, and then the word selected for the name of that modifier. Again, we include this along with the menu item class. This can be one of the biggest downsides to BEM because it does cause our HTML to get pretty long with such verbose class names. However, it makes our CSS extremely easy to write and maintain, so that is sometimes a trade-off worth taking. You'll also notice that we only use classes here, which is pretty typical of BEM and a few other of these methodologies. The primary reason for this is to avoid issues with specificity. By making every selector in CSS a single class, every selector has the same specificity. That said, this does restrict our code a bit, so once again, there are trade-offs to consider. Up next, we have Object-Oriented CSS, or OOCSS. This is based on the concept of object-oriented programming, and it is trying to apply that to CSS. To do so, we treat UI components as objects. Then we divide styles into two categories: structure and skin. Structure properties are the invisible properties such as width, height, and margin, while skin properties are visible, such as colors, fonts, borders, and shadows. Finally, in object-oriented CSS, we make a clear distinction between content and containers. This means that we are avoiding combinators or really any styles dependent on DOM location. This methodology has very similar drawbacks to BEM in that you usually end up with very small classes, which can potentially make the HTML code less readable. And next, we have atomic CSS, which is a fairly simple concept. The idea here is to avoid any repeated declarations and make CSS classes for them. Then these classes will get names based on their function. For example, we might have a paragraph with the classes text medium, text blue, and margin 12 to make that paragraph have medium-sized text, blue font, and 12 pixels of margin. This is great in terms of creating dry CSS, but it tends to be the worst methodology in terms of separating CSS from HTML, so this is a trade-off once again to be considering. Now let's take a look at the scalable and modular architecture for CSS, pronounced SMACS. The idea here is to actually split our CSS into roughly 5 different files, although for simpler projects you might not need all 5. First, we have the base file, and this is for defaults, so it is just a bunch of type selectors. Next, we have the layout file, which contains the major structural layout for the page. This uses a combination of ID selectors and class selectors. The classes are usually prefixed with the letter L and then a dash before the name. So for example, we could have L-nav. Alternatively, some people prefer to use the word layout before the dash, so we could have layout-nav as well, and there are just 2 ways to do the same thing depending on how verbose you want to be with your naming. Next, we have the module file, which contains smaller reusable components. These are generally all class selectors, with the name of the component it is selecting, and no prefixes. Then next, we have the state file, which contains selectors for specific states such as disabled elements. Usually this will just be more classes, and they will be prefixed with the word is and a dash. So for example, we could have is selected or is disabled as classes. Finally, the theme is for style rules for modules or layouts, and oftentimes these are based on user preferences, such as being in a dark mode. That said, many websites won't actually need the theme file at all. Now, the last methodology we will look at in this video will be the inverted triangle, or ITCSS. This methodology is mostly about the ordering of our CSS code rather than having opinions on things such as naming conventions. At the core of this idea is that we should start with selectors that are the most generic, and these will have the least specificity, and they will be the ones that will reach the most elements on the page. This is usually drawn out as this upside down triangle, hence the name inverted triangle. At the top are settings, which are usually things like global variables that will affect the entire web page. These have the most reach, and they're both the least specific and the least explicit. Next, we have tools, which is mostly for mixins and functions if you're using a preprocessor that supports those. Up next, we have the generic layer, which is used for very high-level generic styles. Oftentimes, this is used to reset the browser defaults, which is a common practice to ensure consistency between browsers. The next layer is elements, which will hold our type selectors, and below the elements will be the objects layer. This will have the most generic classes in our website and is often used for larger containers. And then next we have the components, which holds the style for individual UI components, which is oftentimes where the majority of our CSS will end up going. And finally, the trumps layer will hold all of the important rules, which should mostly be reserved for overriding styles provided by frameworks being used, but if we need any important rules, we usually put them at the bottom, as they are the most specific rules we could include. And it's worth noting that these are not the only possible layers for the inverted triangle. The principle of organization would still apply, even if you're using slightly different layers for your project's individual use case. And that's going to be the last methodology we look at in this video. In general, following a CSS methodology can be a great way to ensure that you have consistent, scalable CSS code, but at the same time, you shouldn't feel restricted to using them. Many projects will end up combining ideas and principles from different methodologies that make sense for their individual use cases, and this is perfectly okay. Now finally, let's take a look at some performance concerns within CSS and how we can minimize page load times using CSS. So first, looking at our actual selectors, browsers actually read them from right to left. So for example, here we have a specific ID, and we are selecting paragraphs directly inside of it. You might think this is efficient because the browser just needs to look inside of that ID, but actually the browser will find every paragraph on the page first, and then see if they are inside of the specific ID. In general, IDs tend to be the fastest selector, but if we used IDs for everything, we would have horrible code that is hard to maintain. And that said, browsers are very efficient, so the differences in performance between selectors usually isn't that big of a deal on the modern web, but it's still good to know about and to be thinking about if you have a very complex website. Next, we should try to avoid expensive properties where we can. For example, box shadows are actually very expensive, and if you have too many of them on the page, it can slow down the page. Additionally, certain properties are very slow to animate. So in animations, we usually want to stick to using the transform properties where we can, as those ones have been optimized for the animations. That said, once again, browsers have gotten extremely fast, and usually we just want to prioritize clean code and the outputs that we want over micro-optimizing for efficiency, but this needs to be within reason, of course. We should also try to avoid having any unused style, as this wastes the browser's time and it increases our file size. This sounds like a simple idea, but it can actually happen in a few ways. First, it's very easy to delete some HTML code and then forget to delete the related CSS. So you just need to be careful about doing this. Additionally, this can happen when a website becomes extremely large and has all of their CSS in one file. For example, you could imagine Amazon.com probably has a crazy amount of CSS, and if they gave it to the browser all at once, it would take forever to load. Instead, you should just be giving the browser CSS files necessary for the page it is currently on, or in some cases, components that the user is likely to navigate to soon. Next, to help with these large files, we can use a minimizer. And minimizers are just programs that will take our CSS and turn it into equivalent code but without white space and other wasted characters. As a result, this can make our file sizes much smaller, especially for large projects. Particularly if you are using a framework like Bootstrap, you will want to make sure that you are including the minimized version of that framework and not the larger file. And finally, we can also defer non-essential CSS to prevent render blocking. When the browser gets to our link tags, it is going to complete parsing of that CSS file before it is able to render the page. However, if we have styles that aren't necessary on the initial page load, such as styles for a modal, then we can place those in a different style sheet and defer loading it. There are a few ways to do this, but they are all admittedly a bit hacky. One of the most common solutions will be to change the relationship attribute from style sheet to preload, which tells the browser to asynchronously load in this file as soon as possible. But then we also include the as attribute to tell it that this is a style sheet. Finally, we add the onload property with some simple JavaScript. First, this removes the onload code that we are adding just to make sure the browser doesn't try to run it twice. Then it sets the relationship attribute back to style sheet, which will apply these styles once the browser was done loading in the file, which happened without blocking renders. And finally, we can include a noScript tag, which is a conditional for if the user doesn't have JavaScript in their browser. In the modern day, this doesn't happen too much, but it's still a good practice to be doing. And in this case, we can't run the JavaScript to asynchronously load in our style sheet, so instead, we'll just need to load in the style sheet as normal and have a slightly slower page load. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video on CSS methodologies and best practices. There are, of course, other methodologies that we didn't cover, but they all tend to apply similar principles. Moreover, these performance tricks should be some of the more important ones, but again, in the modern web, these micro-optimizations oftentimes aren't worth the other trade-offs, such as code maintainability, so that is something to always be considering. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing CSS selectors and going over how we can be more specific with what elements we select. So here we have a HTML file, and it's pretty simple. So at the top, we have a top-level heading that is an H1, and you can see it over here in the output. We also have a section with a section heading, which is an H2, and a paragraph section paragraph. You can see that in the output in the middle here. And then we have a footer as well. It also has an H2 and a paragraph, and we can see those down here at the bottom of the output. And finally, we linked a CSS style sheet via the head with this link tag to styles.css. So let's go ahead and open up that CSS file, and we can start working. So first of all, let's look at the most basic selector we can have, and that is a type selector, which just allows you to choose what type of element you want, so what tag you want to select. For example, we can say H1 and do color red, and now you'll see the top level heading becomes red because we selected it via the H1 type selector. Additionally, we can select multiple elements this way by simply separating them with a comma. So we could say H1, H2, and now we see the headings are all red, so all of the headings, because we selected H1s and H2s, and all of the headings on the page are either an H1 or an H2, we end up applying these styles to them. Now, this isn't limited just to similar elements like headings here. We could also say maybe H1, paragraph, and now we see the top level heading is red as well as the paragraphs. And then if we did want to just select absolutely everything, there's also a generic selector. So that is just the asterisk or the star. This is called the universal selector, and you can see it selects literally every element on the page, so everything is red. However, I usually would not recommend using this universal selector. The reason being it usually selects more than you want. So for example, in this case, it is selecting everything on the page, which is maybe what we want. But if we go back to our HTML, it's literally selecting every tag on here. So it's selecting the head, it's selecting the title and this link tag, for instance, and we don't need to make those red. That doesn't do anything. So it's just sort of inefficient. It's adding styles in places we don't need. So usually I would recommend not using it, but occasionally there are use cases, so it's good to know that it's there. But now, what if we wanted to be a little bit more specific? So maybe we wanted to select the H1 and then we wanted to select the section paragraph. How could we go about doing that? Well, there's a few different ways, but I think by far the easiest and most common is by using CSS classes or HTML class attributes. So in HTML, we can come over here, and if we wanted to select the H1, first of all, we'd give it a class, and let's call it red. So the class attribute is an attribute that you can add to any element in HTML, and this is sort of just a generic way to select everything at once that has that class. So we can say this H1, and maybe we want the section paragraph, for instance, and we can say class equals red here as well. Go ahead and save that. And now in our styles.css, instead of using the universal selector, we'll switch to a class selector, which uses the period and then the name of the class. So we want period red, and that will make the top level heading as well as the section heading turn red. And we can combine the different types of selectors using the comma separated list. So for instance, we could do this as well as H2, and now you'll see everything's red except for the footer paragraph because that's the only thing that isn't meeting one of these two criteria. Okay, but now what if we wanted to be even more specific? For instance, what if we wanted to just make one single element red? Maybe we want only the section paragraph to be red and nothing else. Well, we could give it a class of red, so we could get rid of this class, and then we could come back here and get rid of the H2. And that's going to accomplish what we want, but it's probably not the best thing to have classes that only exist once. So alternatively, what we can use is the ID attribute. And this is the same attribute that we've seen for a while. We've seen this in HTML for label tags, for instance, use the ID attribute to link themselves to whatever they are labeling. But here we can use it just to provide a unique identifier to, in this case, this section paragraph. And I'll go ahead and save this. And in the styles.css, this is no longer a class, so we'll remove the period. And for an ID, we use the pound sign. So we can say £sign red, and we can go ahead and make that section paragraph red. And then we could do something like adding another rule set. So maybe we want to also make the H1 color blue. And now you'll see we can sort of mix and match what types of selectors we're using for what we want to select and where. And these are the main selectors you'll see. It's pretty straightforward. We tend to most of the time use a lot of type selectors and a lot of class selectors, and then sporadically we'll use some IDs, but there are other types of selectors and we'll go through those now. However, just know that what we've seen so far is what you will likely use 90+% of the time. So let's go back to our HTML and let's add a link. So inside of this section, I'll go ahead and add an anchor tag, and let's make this a link to Algo Expert. So we'll say algoexpert.io, and we'll say Algo Expert. Save that, and now we get this link to Algo Expert on the page. But what if we wanted to make this link styled specifically, and maybe there was another link somewhere? So maybe this one goes to systemsexpert.io and systems expert. Okay. So now we have a link to systems expert and algo expert. But what if we wanted to style the links? So we can style the links with the A tag, right? So we can say A, and then we want the anchor tags to maybe be color of green. And now the links are green, but what if we wanted this to only affect certain links? Maybe we only want to affect the algo expert link. And one way we could do this is by adding an ID or a class to the Algo Expert link, but another option here is to use an attribute selector. So we can use this by adding these brackets. So this can go next to the name of the type. Alternatively, it can actually go by itself, but we'll do it with the name of the type. And we'll go ahead and say the href attribute, so the hypertext reference, so this is the link. And we want this to be equal to, and then we can set some value. So in this case, we want it to be equal to algoexpert.io. Save that, and now you can see our style is only affecting the Algo Expert link. Now, most of the time with attribute selectors, this is all we need. We just need to say we have some attribute and we want to select some value for it. So in this case, we're selecting links with the attribute of href with algoexpert.io, but sometimes we do want to be even more specific with this. So for example, what if we had another link that also goes to Algo Expert, but this one goes to the product page specifically. And if we do this, now you'll see this one is blue. It's not getting the green text. And the reason for that is its link is not algoexpert.io. It's algoexpert.io / and then product. So the way we can actually fix this is before the equal sign, we can add the little caret. What this says is don't just select algoexpert.io, instead select anything that starts with algoexpert.io. So when I go ahead and save this, you'll see it selects both of the AlgoExpert links, so both the link that is just AlgoExpert as well as the one that ends with something else, but the Systems Expert link will not be selected because it is just a different link. It doesn't match the pattern that we set here. And again, we don't actually need the A here, so we can go ahead and get rid of this and nothing will change. So this would also select any other type of element that has the href attribute set to algoexpert.io. So usually we're a little bit more specific here and we set the type and then the attribute, but sometimes we can just do just the attribute if maybe you wanted to select all of the tags on the page that are disabled, for example. Finally, I want to go back to what we said about using classes and sort of revisit the way we did that. So the classes work, right? It allows us to select more specific elements, but you could imagine in some scenarios that would get overwhelming. You would end up adding classes everywhere, and we don't want to do this. It's good in some scenarios, but in some scenarios, we want something easier to select elements with that all follow some criteria. And the way we can do this is what's called a combinator. And combinators are selectors that use the context of the element in the DOM to decide whether or not it should be selected. And the most basic one of these will select children. So what I'll go ahead and do to make this a little bit easier to look at, let's go ahead and remove these up here. And when I save, you'll see the only styles we have left are the ones selecting the links. So now, what if we wanted to select this section paragraph, but we don't want to select the footer paragraph? So if I just did the p tag and then do color red, you'll see it selects both of them, but all I wanted was this footer paragraph. And the way we can do this is through one of the more basic combinators. And what that is the descendant combinator. So before the p tag, we can add the footer tag. And what this says is look for footers and then look for paragraphs inside of footers. So now I'll go ahead and save this, and only the paragraph inside of a footer is being selected. And we could actually get even more specific with this. So let's go back to our HTML again, and let's add a little bit more code inside of this footer. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a div just for the purpose of demonstration. And then inside of this div, I'll say div paragraph. And now when I save it, you'll see both of these are red, and maybe this is what we want, maybe it's not what we want. But if it wasn't what we want and we only want the direct children, so only paragraphs that are directly inside of the footer, whereas this one is inside of the div, which is inside of the footer, then what we can do is we can go back to the CSS and we can add a greater than sign here. And this is known as a child selector. So I can go ahead and save, and you'll see now we are only selecting the footer paragraph because it is the only paragraph that is directly inside of the footer. Now, the final set of selectors that I want to show are called sibling selectors. So let's go back to the HTML. The idea of a sibling is it's any elements that share the same parent. So for example, all 5 of these elements could be considered siblings. And then an adjacent sibling are siblings that are directly next to each other. So for example, these 2 elements, so the heading and the paragraph, are adjacent siblings. But this H2 and one of these links is not an adjacent sibling because there's an element in between them. And we can select for both of these things. So for example, let's go back to our styles.css, and maybe instead of this footer paragraph, so I'll get rid of that. And now what we can do instead is do something like H2, and then we use the tilde and a paragraph. And what this says is get any paragraph that is a sibling of an H2. And if we go back to the HTML here, you'll see we have this paragraph up here is a sibling of an H2, as well as this paragraph down here. And for example, we could change this. So I'll go ahead and get rid of this for a moment. And we can change this to be a anchor tag that is a sibling of an H2. And you'll see now all 3 of these are red. However, if we wanted just adjacent siblings, what we could do is add the plus sign instead of the tilde. And what this will do is only get the adjacent siblings. And you'll see now if we go back to the HTML, these anchor tags are not adjacent to this H2. However, if we comment out this paragraph, you'll see the first one becomes red, whereas the other links are still blue. The reason being the systems expert link is adjacent to the H2. However, these 2 links, while they are siblings, they're not adjacent siblings, so they don't get selected. That's going to be the final CSS selector we'll look at for now, and that should cover the vast majority of the selectors that you'll ever see, and most selectors from here simply become combinations of the selectors we've seen so far and more complex versions of them, but it should all sort of stem from what we've seen here. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. So pseudo-classes are a way for us in CSS to select elements based on their current state in the DOM. For example, we might want to select just the inputs that are currently disabled. Pseudo-elements are very similar, but they allow us to select certain portions of an element. For example, we might want to select the first letter or the first line of a paragraph, and we can do that using pseudo-elements. Before we get started on that, let's briefly take a look at the HTML file we have here for the demo. So we have a heading in H1 that says Hello World. Below that, we have a paragraph that says Go to AlgoExpert with a link to algoexpert.io. Then we have two paragraphs, AlgoExpert is the best and Front-End Expert is the best. And finally, we have an input of type text with a label that just says input. And of course, in the head, we are linking in our styles.css file. With that, let's move over to the styles.css file, and we can start writing our first pseudo-classes. Pseudo-classes use a colon and then the name of the class. So for example, we can say :link, and what this will select is links, but specifically ones that are unvisited, meaning the user has not clicked on it. And we can do this on the anchor tag if we want. And then inside of the rule set, we can write any normal CSS declarations, such as color red, and this will make the AlgoExpert text turn red. However, if I come to the browser and click on AlgoExpert, it will take us to the AlgoExpert website, of course. Then we hit back, and you'll see the text is now purple. So why is this? Why is the text no longer red? Well, the selector we wrote was on the link pseudo class, and the link pseudo class only selects unvisited links. So once I clicked on AlgoExpert, it became a visited link, and this was no longer selecting it. However, we can say anchor tags that are visited, and this is another pseudo class we can use. It's essentially the opposite of the link pseudo class, and we can say color green. And now you'll see the AlgoExpert text turns green. Now, in addition to styling based on what the user has already done, such as clicking on a link, we also want to style based on what they are currently doing. So to show this, let's go up to the top of the CSS and let's select an input. But let's not just select inputs, let's select focused inputs. And what the focus pseudo class does is it selects inputs that are currently in focus, which simply means they are being actively used by the user. Normally, this is when somebody clicks on it with their mouse, but it can also be when they tab over it with the keyboard or a few other things based on the assistive technologies that they might be using. By default in the browser, when we focus an input, it will show up with this light blue outline. But we can change that using CSS, so let's add the outline rule, and let's change it to be a little bit larger. So let's say it's a 2-pixel solid blue outline, whereas the default one, I believe, is 1 pixel, and now you'll see if we focus this, it becomes much larger and more pronounced. In addition to checking if the input is in focus, we also might want to select it based on what the user has typed in. For example, what if we wanted to select only inputs that currently have invalid input? The way we can do that is with the invalid pseudo class. And what this says is select inputs that do just that. They have invalid input, meaning they are not following the requirements that we set out in HTML. In this case, let's say 2 pixels solid red. Save that and come back to the HTML and let's add a requirement. So let's say it has a minimum length equal to 6. And now if I type, you'll see we get this red outline until we hit 6 characters. But you might have noticed it was a little awkward at the beginning. While I was typing, it was red, but we don't want that to happen to the user. We don't want it to be that they're typing in hello world and it shows up as red before they're even done typing. To understand why this is happening, let's take a look at our CSS. At the top, we have the focus, which is setting it to blue, but then we have invalid below it, which is setting it to red. And in the case where they have typed a few characters and they're still typing, it is both in focus and invalid. So CSS is defaulting to the one lower in the file, which happens to be this invalid one. Now we could simply change the order of the rule blocks, but I think a slightly cleaner way to do this to avoid relying on the order of our file would be to add another pseudo class. So the pseudo classes are actually chainable, and we can add the not pseudo class. And what not does is it takes in a parameter of another selector, and it will select anything that does not fulfill whatever selector we have inside of the parentheses. So for example, we can say not focused. And what this is saying again is select inputs that are invalid, but are also not in focus. And I can save this, and we can come back to our input and start typing, and you'll see it stays blue until we click off of it. And if I were to save it with just hello and click off of it, we would see the red outline because it is no longer in focus and it is invalid. And I think this is a much better user experience than what we might want. Finally, we can also select elements based on their location in the DOM, so what context they exist in. For example, let's come up here to the top, and we can select paragraph tags, but I want the first of type. And what first of type pseudo class says is select the first paragraph in this case, so type being whatever is here, so in this case it is the paragraph tag, and we want this first one, but the first one of a set of siblings. And let's make this color orange. And when I save, you'll see the go-to text becomes orange because it is the first paragraph on the page. But it's not just because it's the first paragraph on the page, it is because it's the first in the set of siblings. So remember, all of these tags are siblings to each other because they share the same parent. However, if I took these paragraphs down here and added a div around them, so let's move these two paragraphs inside of the div, save, you'll see the first one inside of the div also gets the orange text because now Algo Expert is the best, is the first paragraph in its set of direct siblings, which is just these two paragraphs. In addition to first of type, we can also say last of type, which does just as you would expect. It selects the last one. So if we come back to the HTML, the body, so it's children, so the direct children of the body, there's only one paragraph, so that's why this one is still selected. Whereas inside of this div, there are two, so it selected the second paragraph because that is the last one. In addition to this, we can also use nth of type, which takes in a parameter, and this can be a number, so we could say, for example, 1, and this would again select the first one. This is the same as first of type. We can also say something like even, which would select all of the even ones, or odd. And finally in here, we can do some custom functions. So we could do something like 2n minus 1, and this is actually the exact same thing as odd because 2n minus 1 is the equivalent of odd. So this would select the first, third, fifth, and so on and so forth elements. Similar to nth of type, we have one more pseudo class that does a very similar thing. So we can say paragraph, but let's say first child. And in this case, I'll make this color purple. And then let's also comment out the nth of type selector for a moment so they're not conflicting with each other. And you'll see the first child is selecting just Algo Expert is best. So why is this? Well, what first child does is it says, look at every element. So in this case, we start with the body, for example, and we say, look at its first child. The first child here is an H1, and we say, does this child match the selector here? Well, the first child is not a paragraph, so no, it doesn't. And then we move on to the next element. So we have this paragraph. We say, what's its first child? It's not a paragraph either. And then we move on to this div. We say, what's its first child? In its case, the first child is a paragraph, so it gets styled as purple. Along with the first child, we can also do last child, and we can do nth child as well. So maybe we want nth child and we want even children, or we could do odd children as well. And again, this works very similar to nth of type, with the difference being that this is looking at the child number first and checking to see if it matches the selector, whereas nth of type is just looking for that number of the selector within the sibling set. That will do it for the pseudo classes that we're going to look at today. There are tons more. There are lots of pseudo classes that you can learn and play with that represent almost any state that any element on the DOM can have, and they're super powerful. So I do recommend trying to learn more of the useful ones. But we looked at, I think, most of the most commonly used pseudo classes here. But now let's take a look at pseudo elements, which again, pseudo elements allow us to select certain portions of an element. So let's get rid of this selector up here for the paragraph and add a new paragraph selector, but let's make a pseudo element on it. In pseudo elements, the one difference is they use 2 colons and then the name of the pseudo element. So for example, we can say first letter, and sometimes in paragraphs, you want to take the first letter and do something with it, like make it a different font or make it larger. So we could do font size, and let's just make it 2em, which will essentially make it twice as large. And now we get this nice design where our first letter is bigger than the rest. And in addition to first letter, we can also do first line, which will match the entire first line. In this case, all of our paragraphs are only on one line, but if we had a multi-line paragraph, it would select just the first line of it, which is pretty cool. But for now, let's put this back to first letter. And next, what I want to look at is something called before and after. So first we have before, and what before does is it inserts an invisible element before the beginning of the content within the paragraphs that are being selected. So for example, we can use this content CSS rule, and what this allows us to do is add some content. So we can maybe add an arrow that points to our content. And I can save this, and you'll see it appears on the left of the paragraphs, although it looks a little bit awkward here with the font size we have. So I'll just remove the dash, and we can just use the greater than sign for the arrow. You'll also notice that the content we add in the before is actually being applied to by the first letter selector. And then finally, after works very similar. So we can say paragraphs after, and maybe here we'll do content and just add an exclamation point to the end of all of our paragraphs, and you'll see each one gets a new exclamation point. One thing you might notice here, though, is that there is a space after Algo Expert before this exclamation point. And the reason for this is that we went to a new line after the anchor tag. So this is one of the few times in HTML where the white space will be noticed. So again, white space is condensed down to a single space. So all of this space here became a space character in the HTML. So this is one of the only times we'll need to put the closing tag on the same line if we do want to use this content after CSS syntax. But of course, this isn't the best way to accomplish this. If we just wanted an exclamation point, we would want to just add that in the HTML itself. But there are times when we do want to add some specific styling at the end of the element, and we can do that using this after pseudo element. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing what happens to conflicting CSS declarations. For example, here we have 2 rule sets. The first selects anchor tags with an href attribute of algoexpert.io and sets their color to be green. The second selects anchor tags inside of sections with a class of links and sets their color to be red. But this raises a question: what happens if an anchor tag is inside of a section with class links and it has the href attribute set to algoexpert.io? Will it be green or red? So the way CSS actually handles this is through what it calls specificity. The more specific of selectors that are used to select the elements, the higher weighting the related declarations will get. So essentially we say that the most specific selector is the one that gets used, and by default, if all of the selectors have the same specificity, then it will just use whichever one was last in the file that it is reading. But then that raises the question of, how do we actually weight these selectors? What does it mean to be specific? And the way that this works is actually quite formulaic and easy to calculate. So we split up each type of selector and then we provide them a value. And finally, we count up how many of each type we have and multiply them by the values that we assigned to them. And then at that point, we have an end number, or a weight as we call it, and we choose whichever rule is within a selector that has the highest weight. So the way this will work is inline styles. So this is any style that you write directly in HTML using the style attribute, and we would almost always recommend not to do this. But if you did, those get a weight of 1,000 points. And this essentially is like a trump card. It will almost always just mean that the inline styles are going to be the ones that get displayed. Next, we have the ID selector, which we give a weight of 100 points. And then we have classes, which we give a weight of 10 points, along with pseudo-classes and attributes, also both get a weight of 10 points. Finally, elements, so the actual element selector or the name of the tag gets a single point, as well as pseudo-elements also get just a single point. Now let's look back at that example of the two conflicting anchor tags. In the first option, first we have the A element, and elements get 1 point. And then we have the href attribute, and attributes get 10 points. We add these together, and we have 11 total points for the weight of the first option. Then we look at the second selector we had that starts with the section element, which gets 1 point. And then it has the links class, which adds on another 10 points. And then we have the anchor tag element, and this gets 1 more point. And if we add all of these together, we end up with 12 points, meaning that the second option has 12 points over the 11 points of the first option. So the second option is more specific, and the color of the anchor tag will be red. Now that's all there is to CSS specificity. That's basically all the browser is doing when it resolves the conflicts between conflicting declarations. However, sometimes we want the ability to override this, to say a specific declaration should be used regardless of how specific the selector is. And the way we do this is with what we call exclamation point important, or the important rule. This goes at the end of a declaration, so after the value but before the semicolon. And this simply says that the declaration is so important that we should use this one regardless of specificity. In fact, this can even overwrite a user style sheet if that user style sheet doesn't use the important rule. Because of this, most of the time we want to avoid using important. It's usually considered a bit of an anti-pattern that goes against the cascading nature of CSS. However, there are times when it can be appropriate. For example, if we are using a library, we might want to use important to override a declaration of that library without worrying about the specificity of the library's selectors. But again, this should be seen as the exception to the rule, because for most CSS, when we write the entire thing, we have full control over all of it, and we should be using specificity to our advantage rather than having to go around it. And that said, that's going to be the end of this video on CSS selector specificity. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the various units in CSS and how to choose which ones to use. To get started, let's look at the various units that we can use for lengths. These can be used for properties such as width, height, font size, margin, and a bunch more. The most basic of these units is pixels, which uses the px unit. The most important point here is that pixels are an absolute length, meaning that they don't scale as the items around them scale, or if the user style sheet has larger sizes on it. There are a variety of other absolute units, such as inches and centimeters. However, these don't tend to get used much, so we won't be focusing on them in this video. On the other hand, relative units make our lengths relative to something else, and there is a variety of useful units here to choose what that something else is. For the EM unit, it will be relative to the font size. Moreover, if you're using an EM to set a font size, it will be relative to the parent's font size. REM is very similar to EM, except it is relative to the root element, which is the HTML tag. By default, this is usually 16 pixels, but we can always change that by changing the font size on the HTML tag. Moreover, this is oftentimes overridden by browser font size settings. VW and VH stand for viewport height and viewport width. So as the name suggests, they are relative to the size of the viewport. For example, 1 VW is equal to 1% of the width of the viewport, 50 VW is 50% of the width of the viewport, and so on and so forth. The CH unit is relative to the width of the 0 character in the current font, which essentially allows us to make widths based on the number of characters in a paragraph. Finally, percentages represent a percentage value relative to something else, usually the parent's value for that same property. However, do be aware that sometimes this can act differently depending on what property you are using. So that's great, but how do we choose which units to use? There are no hard set rules, but we can go over some general guidelines to keep in mind when choosing units. And of course, if you're coming into a project that is already in progress, being consistent with the existing code is oftentimes your best bet. First, let's look at widths and heights. For these, we oftentimes want to use the percentage unit, so the values are relative to the size of the parent. For example, it is common to want an element to take half of the width of the parent. Additionally, we can also use the VW for widths and the VH for heights, occasionally when we need a size that is relative to the entire viewport. This can be helpful for creating websites with a single page full screen style effect. The CH unit is very useful for a specific use case, and that is choosing the width of a paragraph. Once paragraphs go over about 70 characters in a line, they become really hard to read. So setting a CH value around 50 to 70 can be a good way to get a good readable paragraph. Finally, if you need an absolute value, I would usually recommend using REM. This is still a relative value, keep that in mind, but it is the closest relative unit to being absolute. What I mean by this is that for most users, it will display relative to 16 pixels, and it's not relative to anything else on the page. However, for users who have chosen to change their default font sizes, this will still scale properly. And as a last resort, if you absolutely need the width or the height to never change, pixels can be used sparingly. However, do keep in mind that this can be detrimental to accessibility, so we'll want to be careful using these. Next, let's look at margin and padding. For these, I tend to prefer using REM units for the same reason as widths and heights. They feel consistent and absolute, but will still scale with user preferences. However, sometimes the EM unit can be useful here as well. For example, if you have two sizes of the same element, you could use the EM to make sure that the margin and padding scales up with the larger font size. Finally, pixels can be used here, but again, I would be careful with this due to accessibility. As a general rule, pixels are fine for very small values, such as a 10 pixel padding, but as the values increase, you'll usually want to prefer REM, or of course you could just use REM for all of these values and almost never use pixel values at all. That said, moving on to borders and shadows, pixel values are usually fine here because we oftentimes don't actually want these to scale. Sometimes if a shadow is defined with REM or EM, it will become too big for some users, and this just won't look great. But that said, REM and EM are also perfectly okay here if that's the effect you're after. It's really just a choice of what exactly you want your borders and shadows to look like when a user has a larger font size. And lastly, for font sizes, I prefer using REM. These scale with user preferences while still being easy to work with. EM can be good if you want your values to scale with the parent size, but I tend to find these confusing in larger projects as the calculations for font size get kind of hard to follow if there's a large chain of parents. Pixels can be a last resort here, but in general, I would avoid them as they will oftentimes end up preventing your fonts from scaling with those user preferences. And like we've said already, we don't want to be preventing user preferences from working. Now, finally, let's take a look at colors. With colors, there are a few ways to represent them, but they are all essentially the same thing. So I would mostly just choose the syntax that you're most comfortable with. First, we can use the names of the colors, and this is for super common colors like white, black, red, or blue. However, for full projects, I would usually avoid these absolute colors, especially the ones like red and blue, because they can look pretty generic, and they also tend to be a little bit jarring to the eye. Next, we can represent colors using hexadecimal codes. The first two characters represent the amount in red, the second two represent the amount of green, and the third two represent the amount of blue. Next, RGB works the exact same way, except with comma-separated values and standard base 10 instead of hexadecimal. Additionally, there is an option here to include a last alpha value from 0 to 1, which essentially is the opacity of the color. Finally, HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness, with saturation and lightness being represented as percentages. This can also take an alpha value at the end, just like the RGB values can. It's also worth noting that for both the HSL and the RGB functions, it doesn't actually matter if you include the A at the end of the function. You can always include the alpha value regardless. These two functions are actually just aliases for the same thing with different names. Now, as for the right format, it's really up to you. Hexadecimal tends to be the most common, but personally, I find hexadecimal hard to interpret. It's hard to understand the meaning of it. However, the RGB values or the HSL values can be a little bit easier for a human to just read the name of the color and understand what it might look like. But again, it's up to personal preference, and the one thing I would say is make sure you're being consistent, at least within one project. So you don't want to have one CSS file with multiple styles of color, because that can be a little bit confusing to read. And with that, let's move over to the code and do a quick demo of the differences between these units that we have seen. So here we have a div with the ID of parent, and it is the black border in the output on the right. And inside of that parent are three more divs, red, blue, and green, which are represented by the red, blue, and green boxes that you can see on the screen, and we'll see how exactly those are styled in a moment. And then below that, we have a long paragraph that says, "I am a very long paragraph," a bunch of times. So with that, let's move over to the CSS and take a look at how this is all working. So first, let's look at the widths. The parent has a width of 75%. So this is taking up 75% of its parent, which is the body. So 75% of the body, which is nearly the entire page. And then red takes a width of 50%. And 50% in this case is 50% of red's parent, which is parent. So red is 50% of 75% if we wanted to get red's entire percentage of the body it's taking up. But if we look at the output, that's why red is taking up half of its container. And then we can go to blue, and it's using a width of 50 VW, or 50 viewport width, meaning it is half of the size of the browser window. Finally, we have green, and it is using 10 REM as its width, which is essentially like using an absolute width in this case, because we haven't changed the HTML element. So the width of this will be 16 times 10, which is 160 pixels, assuming that the user hasn't changed anything with their preferences in the browser for the default font sizes. But now, what would happen if we changed the width of the parent? Let's make this, say, 50%. And we can save, and you can see now the blue one is actually overflowing, because 50 VW is larger than the space the blue one had to fill of this parent. The red one, on the other hand, is still filling up half of the space of the parent because it is scaling down with the size of the parent. And the green one now is taking up about half of the width of the parent, but it hasn't changed. It's taking up the exact amount of space it was before, just like the blue one is taking up the exact amount of space it was before. And then if we scale this down even more, say making the parent 15%, now red is still fitting inside. It's taking up half of the parent still. But now both blue and green are overflowing, and this shows why, in general, I would recommend using percentages for widths. That way that your widths don't start overflowing, and they will scale down with the size of the parent and always fit inside of it. Next, let's look at this paragraph. It's super long, and it's kind of hard to read because of how long it is, but if I was using an even bigger browser window, it would be even harder to read. And this is a pretty bad user experience. So what we should do is we should change the way that paragraph is scaling. So let's do paragraph, and let's adjust its width. And usually what I recommend here is the CH unit. So we can say 60 CH, and that'll make it just a little bit easier to read. Now what's nice here is the width is entirely based on the font size and the font family. Essentially, we are saying we want a width of exactly 60 characters, regardless of the actual size that renders. So if I were to expand my browser window, you'll see the new lines don't change at all. This helps keep our paragraphs super easy to read, regardless of what size screen somebody is using to view them. However, if I came back and changed the width to 50%, then we no longer get these nice properties. Eventually, if I had a big enough monitor, then the entire paragraph would still end up on one line, which runs into the same readability problem we had initially. Moreover, it will even get hard to read if the page gets super small, trying to fit it all in a tiny window, when in that case we might prefer to just have a scroll bar. So in general, I would recommend using the CH unit for this. So let's go back to 60 CH, save that, and let's resize this a little bit again. Next, let's take a look at the font sizes. So right now, we haven't set any font sizes, so it's all just defaulting to 16 pixels because that's what the root element is set to. But what we can do is inside of red, let's set a font size of 1 EM. And then inside of blue, we'll set a font size of 1 REM. And finally, inside of green, let's set a font size of 16 pixels. We can save this, and you'll see nothing changes. And the reason nothing changes is, well, green is 16 pixels, which was the default. Blue is 1 REM, which is looking at the root element, which we haven't changed, so that's still 16 pixels. Red is looking at its parent, which is this parent div, which also hasn't been changed, so this is defaulting to its parent, which is the body, and eventually defaulting all the way back up to the root element, which is 16 pixels. But if we change the font size to the parent, say to 1.5 EM, and we save this, you'll see red gets a little bit bigger. And the reason for that is that red is EM, so it is relative to the parent. So this is also essentially now 1.5 EM because it's 1 times 1.5 EM, which will be 24 pixels because the root element is currently 16 pixels. Let's also go ahead and make this a little bit bigger again as well. Let's go back to 50% so we can see things a little bit easier. And now let's go and actually change the root element. So let's say HTML, and we can set this one to have a font size of, say, 24 pixels. So the default, again, is 16 pixels. So essentially now we're just making all of these scaling or relative font sizes 50% bigger. So now what's happened is the parent font size is 1.5 EM, which is 1.5 times its parent, and its parent is the body, and then its parent is the HTML. So it's going to be 1.5 times this 24 pixels. So this is going to be 36 pixels. And then the red is a font size of 1 EM, so it is the same as its parent, so it's also 36 pixels. Blue has a font size of 1 REM, and REM is going to just go to the HTML font size. So 1 REM is 1 root size, so it is 24 pixels for the blue font. And then the green font is still set as an absolute font in pixels, so it is still at 16 pixels. This is why we don't recommend using pixels for font sizes most of the time, because it won't scale if the user has changed the value of the root element in their browser. Now lastly, let's take a look at colors. So I'm going to change the background color of this blue one away from the standard blue, and instead let's add a hex value. So we can create a hex value starting with the pound sign, and then we add in the actual hex code 4B7DAF, and then the semicolon, and you can see that's a slightly lighter blue. And this is oftentimes the most common way that people display colors in CSS, but personally, I just find it hard to read. I see 4B7DAF, and I don't know what that means. But what we can do is instead have the same value, but as an RGB value, and personally, I think this is a lot easier to understand. So this RGB value would be 75, 125, 175. So that's going to be 75 red, 125 green, and 175 blue. And these are values from 0 to 255. Once we save, you'll see nothing actually changes, and that's because the value is the same, but I think this is a bit easier to read. We can easily see this and say, okay, this is mostly a blue and greenish color with maybe a little bit of red in there. We can also add an alpha value here, so we can add one more value to the end, and this will be from 0 to 1. So for example, we can say 0.5, save that, and now it becomes a little bit transparent. And if we change this back to 1, it would look the same as if we had no alpha value, and if we make it 0, it will be completely invisible. So I'll go back to 0.5 here and save it again. And now lastly, let's take a look at the same color, but using an HSL value. So HSL is hue, saturation, and light. So the hue value to get the same color is going to be 210. The saturation is going to be 40%. So we'll do this as a percentage. And then the lightness will be 49%. Do that as a percentage as well, and we can leave the alpha value alone, and you'll see nothing changes with the output. It looks the exact same. So again, with these colors, it's up to you which style you prefer, but just make sure you are being consistent. You don't want to be going back and forth in one file between different styles of colors. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing the difference between a block and an inline element. So here we have two different paragraphs. The first one says, I'm a paragraph. The second one says, I'm another paragraph with an emphasis tag in the middle of it. And if we go to the styles.css, all we are doing is taking the paragraphs and giving them a black border, and the emphasis tag is getting a blue border. And what you might notice when you look at the output is that the paragraph tag, regardless of how much text is actually in it, that border is taking up the entire width of the parent, so the entire width of the body. But why is that happening? Well, the reason for this is that the paragraph tag defaults to what we call a block level element. And block level elements do two things. One, they default to taking up the entire width of their parent. And two, they start on a new line. So regardless of how big these paragraphs are, they start on a new line. And we can actually test this by changing their width. So even though the width starts by being the entire width, we can change it and maybe do just 30 VW. And now the width gets much smaller and we could easily fit both of these paragraphs on one line, but they still end up going to a new line. The emphasis tag, on the other hand, is an inline element. And inline elements don't start on new lines and they only take up the width of their content. We can test this as well. So for example, I could set a width here of 100 VW and nothing is going to change. Why does nothing change? Well, because it's an inline element, it's just looking at the width of its content. It doesn't care what values you set here. The same thing is true for height. So I could set a height of 100 VH, which should be the entire height of the page. But again, this does absolutely nothing. That said, we actually can change the display property of an element if we ever need to. Most of the time you don't want to. All of the tags that contain just small pieces of text and content like emphasis and strong will usually all be inline elements by default, and that's what we want. And all of the larger containers tend to default to block, which is what we want for those. But if we ever do want to change it, we can do this with the display property. So if I make the emphasis tag displayed block and save it, you'll see now it is taking up 100 VW width and 100 VH height. And then if I were to get rid of this width and height and save it, you'll see the emphasis tag is now acting like the paragraphs. It's getting its own line. The only reason it's sort of squished up against the other ones is that the paragraph tag has some default margin, whereas the emphasis tag does not have any margin on it currently. But we could, of course, set some margin of, let's say, 10 pixels for a moment, and you'll see it now sort of splits itself up a little bit, but it is still inside of the paragraph that it was nested in inside of the HTML. So let's go ahead and get rid of this and look at the paragraphs one more time. What if we did want the paragraphs to be on the same line as each other? Well, I guess there's a few ways we could solve this. One, we could set a display of inline, and now we'll see they end up on the same line. But you'll notice this 30 VW isn't making any effect anymore, and that's because this is an inline element. Inline elements, like we said, can't have a width or a height. So setting the width and height no longer works. So what we can actually do here is add display inline block. And this is sort of a middle ground where it doesn't go to a new line, but you can still create custom widths and heights. So now we can see each of our paragraphs get this 30 VW width that we selected, as well as they are on the same line. There are plenty of other ways that we can get elements on the same lines, and we'll see more of that in future videos, but this is one of those ways, and we don't tend to use this a ton, but it can be nice to know that it exists. By default, the vast majority of the container style elements we've seen will be display block. The vast majority of the content, the small pieces of content like we saw with emphasis, will be display inline, and really the only tag we tend to see with inline block is images. And this is useful because images we oftentimes want to resize, but we usually don't want them taking up their own line, so inline block makes sense for those. Now that's all there is to display inline versus block. There are a few other values that we can pass to the display property, but for the most part we tend to use inline and block, and these are the main defaults. We will of course see more of these display properties throughout the crash course, especially with CSS, Flexbox, and Grid. But for now, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the box model, which explains how elements are displayed on the page, specifically using margin, border, padding, and the actual content of those elements. So here we have two paragraphs. I'm a paragraph and I'm another paragraph. And then inside of styles.css, we've set a few properties. We have a margin of 24 pixels on the paragraphs, a padding of 10 pixels on the paragraphs, and a border with 2 pixels of solid black. And then we also have this background color of light blue. So we can come over to the actual output and we can see that we have our two paragraphs. There's some space between them. There's also some space between the content of the paragraph and that black border. So what's actually happening here? We can see in the Chrome inspector, we have our two paragraphs. And if we hover over both of them, we can see the values. And if we look at the bottom right of the styles panel, we can see all of the different values that we have set. So in the middle here, we see the actual content, and this gets highlighted in the output as well. And you can see this sort of just wraps the content of the paragraph, and this goes all the way to the end of the element because this is a block element. So it is filling up the entire width of the parent, which in this case is the body. And then directly outside of the content, we have that padding, and the padding is 10 pixels on all sides because that's what we set in CSS. And this is space in between the content and the edge or the border. So this space is sort of like it's inside of the content in the sense of the background is still there. So this still gets the blue background color, but it is outside of the content. It's just before the border of the content. And then we have the border, which is that 2 pixel solid black that we set. And finally, we have margin, which margin is the space that an element says, this is the minimum space I want between me and other elements. And I say the minimum because one thing you might notice is that even though both of these paragraphs have 24 pixels of margin, they are only 24 pixels away from each other. Those margins aren't adding together. And the way this works is called collapsing margins. So with the vertical alignment, the margins will collapse, meaning we will just use whichever margin value is bigger. However, with horizontal margins, that actually doesn't happen and the margins will be added up together. So if these were next to each other horizontally, we would be adding the values rather than just taking the larger one. One of the first things you might notice here is that we've set the margin to be 24 pixels, and this is affecting every direction. However, we might want to only set the margin for certain values. We can see here in the inspector, if we go over to the paragraph tag, the margin has 24 pixels, and we can hit this little arrow to see all of the individual values. So margin is actually margin top, right, bottom, and left. So I'll disable this value for a moment and you'll see the paragraphs get a little bit closer together. There's still some margin because there's default margin coming from the user agent style sheet, which in this case is 1 EM. However, let's go back up to the paragraph, and what we can do is say maybe all we want is margin bottom, and we want this to be, let's put something pretty big so it's easy to see, 48 pixels. And now you'll see this is essentially pushing the element below the first paragraph down. Or the other way we can define these is we can say margin, and then we can do one at a time. So I could say top might be 48 pixels, and then we go right, and maybe I want right to be 24 pixels, and then we do bottom, and maybe I don't want any bottom margin, so I'll do 0, and then we can do left margin, and let's say I want just 10 pixels on the left. And again, what this does is top, right, bottom, left. It goes clockwise, starting from 12 o'clock, and you can see those same values if we open this up. We can also define this as just vertical and horizontal. So for example, I could say 48 pixels, 24 pixels, and what this says is 24 pixels of right and left, and 48 pixels of top and bottom. Finally, we can also use a value of margin auto, and what margin auto does is it essentially just allows the browser to sort of make a decision, and most of the time this will default to be 0. So you can see with margin auto, these paragraphs are essentially touching each other. But what we can also do with margin auto is use it to center elements. So if I come to this paragraph again, we can add a width of say 30%, and you'll see the element is actually centered. However, if we get rid of margin auto, the element will not be centered. It goes back over to the left. So a lot of times you'll see something like 24 pixels space auto to say we want 24 pixels of vertical margin, and then we just want to center the element. And that's a good way to get a very easy, simple layout that works very well. Finally, there's one more trick with margin that we can play around with, and that is to set a negative margin. So I'll go ahead and disable these as well. And let's add one more rule that's just margin left margin left and say -10 pixels. And what this is going to do, as you just saw, is it is going to shift the elements 10 pixels over to the left. So while margin generally pushes elements away, negative margin pulls it closer to the elements on the side of it. So in this case, just to the edge of the body. And when I disable this, you can see it moves back over to the right, and margin left negative moves it left again. We usually want to avoid using negative margins too much because it can create some weird effects in our layout, but they can be nice occasionally when you just need to shift something over slightly, and it's an easy way to go about doing that. Finally, let's take a look at this inline element. So I'm going to disable the margin left and move into this paragraph and look at this inline emphasis tag. So with this emphasis tag, let's set a margin and say 24 pixels. Now what you'll see is that the horizontal margin is working. It's pushing the text away, and the word paragraph actually even went to a new line because the paragraph ran out of space, but it's not making any vertical margins. It's not pushing anything vertically 24 pixels away from it. And when I highlight the EM, you don't even see that vertical margin. The reason being that vertical margins have no effect on inline elements. And this is true of padding as well, so vertical padding on an inline element does nothing either. And with that, let's go back up to the paragraph and talk about padding. Padding works very similar to margin, with the primary difference being that the space goes inside of the border rather than outside of the border. So padding's purpose is not to push the element away from other elements, its purpose is to push the border farther away or closer to the content. And again, padding works exactly the same way. It has a padding top, right, bottom, and left, and we can set these values individually or using just the padding name. That said, one thing worth pointing out is that not everything works the exact same. For example, padding cannot take a negative value. So if I were to give this a padding value of, say, -10 pixels, it's just going to give me this little yellow warning to say that this is an invalid property. So I'll go ahead and change this back to 10 pixels and it will work again. And finally, let's take a look at how we can edit the border. So here you can see we have a border of 2 pixels solid black. We can disable that and the black border goes away. There's not that much to the border. The one thing to know is that you can set just one direction, just like you can with padding and margin. So I could say border top, 2 pixels solid red. And you'll see we get this red border at the top, but there's no other border. And we could set different borders on different sides. So I could also say border bottom, 2 pixels solid black. And now we have the black border on the bottom and the red border on the top. We can also set what we call a border radius. So border radius, and this allows us to add some curvature to the outside of the element. So for example, I could say 10 pixels. And we get a nice curved edge to these paragraphs instead of the sharp corners. Lastly, we can also set the border radius using a percentage. So I could say something like 50%. And since the radius of a circle is half of the diameter or half of the width, setting the border radius to 50% essentially says that we want a circular shape. And if this was actually a square, so if I changed the width to say 300 pixels and gave it a height of 300 pixels as well, you'll see that now we actually have an exact circle. And the reason for this is that the radius, again, is half of the diameter. So by setting the border radius to half of the size of the element, we are setting it to the exact length of the radius, which is creating a perfect circle. You will notice though that the text is actually no longer even inside of the circle. And the reason for that is that we still use the box model. Even though it looks like a circle, this is still a box. So if I hover over the paragraph, you'll see the shape of the content is still rectangular. We just have this border that is a circular shape. And because of that, the text is outside of that border. However, we could center the paragraph text using Flexbox or some other properties that we'll see later on in the crash course, and then get a effect where we have a circle with centered text inside of it. But anyways, for now, I will get rid of this border radius and we will go back to what we had. Let's get rid of the width and height as well and make this bigger once again. And finally, to recap, let's take one last look at the box model. So inside in the middle, we have the content. This is the actual content of our element. And then outside of the content, we have the padding. This is space between the element and the border. and background colors will affect this because the background color affects inside of the border. And then we have the border, which is the edges of the element. We can set the top, right, bottom, left all differently. We can also set a border radius to give rounded edges. And finally, we have the margin, which defines the space in between two different elements. With vertical spacing, this is going to be collapsed, whereas horizontal spacing, it will add the values together. And that's all there is to the box model. It's fairly straightforward, but it's also a very powerful way to lay out our elements. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the box sizing CSS property. So here in this example, we have a div with the ID of container, and inside of that div, we have an h1 with the text of container, and then we have another div with the ID of child and an h2 that says child. And if we come over to the styles.css, you can see the CSS file for this output. The container has a width of 300 pixels and that background color of light blue. And then the child also has a width of 100%, so the entire size of the container. And then it has a border of 10 pixels solid black, a padding of 12 pixels, and a background color of orange. But then if we look at the output, the child is overflowing from the container. So what's happening here? We set the width to 100%, which should say 100% of the size of the container. But the issue is setting the width to 100% sets the width of the content. But in addition to this content, we have 10 pixels of border and 12 pixels of padding. And because this is on each side, we actually have 20 total pixels of border, 10 pixels on the left and 10 pixels on the right. And we have 24 pixels of padding, 12 on the left and 12 on the right. So this is causing our child to overflow because this isn't being accounted for in the width. And we could solve this using the calc function. So calc allows us to add, subtract, multiply, and divide values of different units. So I could say 100% minus 20 pixels for the border minus 24 pixels for the padding. And this would end up working. This does what we want, but this is kind of gross. This is not very clean code. And now we have these values that are hard-coded to these other values. And we will see in the CSS variables video how we can avoid hard-coding all of these values, but it's still not very clean code. So how else could we solve this? And the solution is the box sizing property. So I will set this back to 100%. And then we can use the box sizing property. And what the box sizing property does is it says, should we use the width and height of the content or all the way out to the edge of the border? So here, if we set this to box sizing content box, this is the default, and it's not going to change anything because of the fact that the size of the box, so the size of the width, is affecting the width of just the content. However, we can change this to border box, which simply says that the width and height now contain the padding as well as the border. So this value of width 100% is now the equivalent of what we did before. It is just automatically subtracting the width of the border and the width of the padding for us. So width 100% is no longer 300 pixels. It is now the equivalent of 300 pixels minus 20 pixels minus 24 pixels. Now, some people love border box and think it's just a much cleaner box sizing, whereas other people like the content box and prefer to use that method and only switch to border box when they need it. But a very common CSS rule set you will see will be to have the universal selector and just set the entire page to use box sizing border box, which will allow us to not need this property here. And then in the scenario where you might need a content box, you could switch it back. But again, it's up to you if you prefer to have this set for every single property, or if you want to just set it individually when you need it. However, if you're coming into a project that other people had already been working on, I would recommend checking to see what their box sizing property is set to right before you start doing any CSS work, because you need to know how your widths and your heights are going to be calculated. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.